Spring 1775. Bloodshed at Lexington and Concord has inflamed the colonies. The Continental Congress rushes back to Philadelphia to take up the growing conflict, as militia units from all over New England pour into Massachusetts to back up their neighbors.
And the militias are certain that they can defeat the British Army because they have this revolutionary fire and spirit. And they argue that one man with that sort of spirit is worth 100 British regulars.
One such man who comes to Massachusetts is a fearless officer from Connecticut. His name, Benedict Arnold, a man intent on doing great things in the coming war. Arnold has a bold military plan for the Patriot cause.
When Benedict Arnold marched into the New England camp outside Boston right after Lexington and Concord, he was spit and polish. And he made such a physical impression when he sat on a fine horse. He was literally a commanding figure. Men looked up to him.
Arnold has come by his regal bearing the hard way. Born into a life of privilege, his alcoholic father squandered the family's fortune, a traumatic turnabout that forced Benedict, at 13, to apprentice with an apothecary. At 15, he ran away to fight with the Connecticut militia in the French and Indian War. After the war, he overcame his lowly circumstances to achieve wealth and success in business. But the angry, resentful youth has grown into a bitter and arrogant man whose contempt for British rule has made him a militant patriot. Arnold convinces the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to send him on a mission that will grab personal glory for himself and desperately needed ammunition for the rebels, to capture the guns at Fort Ticonderoga, the massive but loosely guarded British garrison in the upper reaches of New York.
Fort Ticonderoga, people referred to it as the Gibraltar of North America. It was, by all standards, the most spectacular fortress in North America.
As Arnold sets out on his quest to capture the fort, he hears that another soon-to-be famous name is driven by the same idea. Ethan Allen, a hard-drinking, hard-living frontiersman from Connecticut, couldn't be more different from Benedict Arnold. Allen has been engaged by Connecticut's Congress to rally his personal militia for its own mission to Fort Ticonderoga. These are the notorious Green Mountain Boys, who have been fighting their own war of independence against New York settlers.
Ethan Allen, their colonel commandant, organized about 2,000 armed frontiersmen in what is now Vermont, who for 5 years had been fighting New Yorkers to keep them out of their farms, out of their new territory. And they were willing to fight for their land. And they could move very quickly.
The Green Mountain Boys jump at the opportunity to take on the British. Taking separate paths, Allen and Arnold, each with his own orders, head towards Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold is alone, expecting to recruit men along the way. Allen and his men are already preparing the attack. Their paths cross 30 miles from their target. Arnold presents Allen with his Massachusetts orders and assumes he will command the operation. Allen, full of swagger as always, all but laughs in Arnold's face.
These really are very vain, egotistical men, two strong personalities, very much interested in the accumulation of individual glory.
The Green Mountain Boys were personally loyal to Allen, which Benedict Arnold found out to his chagrin when he arrived and tried to take over the attack on Ticonderoga. And they put down their guns, and they said they were going to march home, that they would only fight for Ethan Allen.
Arnold grudgingly agrees to conduct the raid with these men, but finds himself relegated to second in command. It is a humiliating confrontation. In the pre-dawn hours of May 10th, 83 Green Mountain Boys and 50 Massachusetts militiamen sneak up on the British stronghold. The 50 sleeping redcoats inside have gone undisturbed in the wilderness for so long, they are totally unprepared for what's about to hit them. It's over in minutes. The British soldiers surrender without a fight. The fort's valuable artillery stores now belong to the rebels.
They essentially stole the fort from the British. They were able to essentially walk in a manner of speaking, the British really left the keys in the door to Fort Ticonderoga.
What happens next turns Arnold's stomach. Allen's men find 90 gallons of rum, go on a 3-day binge, and tear the place apart, leaving Arnold to mop up after them. But the worst insult comes when Allen writes to Arnold's superiors in the Massachusetts Congress. Allen brazenly takes complete credit for the operation. He keeps all the glory for himself and purposely makes no mention of his rival, Benedict Arnold. For Arnold, it's a wound more devastating than being shot.
For an officer's honor, public recognition was key. If you'd played an important role and you weren't mentioned, that was very disrespectful. So Arnold was justifiably offended.
The affront to his honor is the first of many slights that will dog Benedict Arnold throughout the war and ultimately drive him to infamy. In Philadelphia, the men of Continental Congress reconvene in the Pennsylvania State House, which will later be named Independence Hall. They greet the capture of Fort Ticonderoga with decidedly mixed feelings. Still hoping for peace, they have refrained up till now from authorizing offensive actions against the British.
The capture of Fort Ticonderoga catches the Continental Congress largely off guard. They had not anticipated this, they did not desire this, and it now has forced their hand. They know that a military response is inevitable, and they now must scramble to take action.
The time has come for the 13 colonies to become a united military as well as political force. It issues currency against future tax collections from the colonies to raise and supply an army. Their mission now is to conduct a war, even while searching for a way to avoid it.
We ought immediately to adopt the army as a continental army, take upon ourselves the pay, subsistence, clothing, armor, and munitions of the troops. John Adams.
Adams urges the immediate appointment of a commander to head up this new army. His Massachusetts colleague, John Hancock, a vain, ambitious man who has just been elected president of Congress, assumes he will be offered this even more important role. His friend Adams is about to nominate him, or so he thinks.
And that is a gentleman among us, and very well known to all of us. A gentleman whose skill and experience as an officer, whose independent fortune, great talents, and excellent universal character would command the approbation of all the colonies better than any other person in the Union. That is the gentleman from Virginia.
Hancock is stunned. Adams passes him over for a gentleman planter from Virginia, George Washington.
The Continental Congress wanted a national army, not just a Massachusetts army or a New England army. They thought that by getting a commander-in-chief from a different colony would balance that. So they cast a welcome eye on Washington from Virginia.
At 6 feet 2 inches and 215 pounds, George Washington cuts an imposing figure. Prior to his nomination, he spoke very little in session, yet spoke volumes about his intentions by showing up every day dressed in a military uniform.
Well, here's a very impressive guy. I mean, he wears this military uniform with great dignity, and of course he shows up making the point. I have military experience. I am a person who you can count on as your military commander.
So he has the image to do it, he's got the experience, he's from Virginia. They make him the commander-in-chief, and he modestly says, I'm really not equal to the task, and I'll just do my best.
But lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorable to my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with. George Washington.
His behavior seems somewhat disingenuous. Clearly, he wanted it. He was very ambitious. He was particularly ambitious in military matters.
Early on, he realizes that the best way to be ambitious is to convince everyone else that you're not ambitious. And he follows this through his entire life.
Ambitious, disingenuous, modest. Who is this man, George Washington, the man appointed to construct a new continental army? In 1775, he is hardly a household name.
He's one of the wealthiest men in the country. He's in his mid-40s and really should be in retirement at that time. Washington is someone who has nothing to gain from participation in the Revolution and everything to lose.
He wasn't born to wealth. Washington's father was a Virginia farmer who died in 1743 when George was only 11. Young George's circumstances were modest, but his dreams were big.
But he envisioned himself dancing at the grand balls in the huge homes of the rich. He envisioned himself being a great landowner. And these were dreams that he pursued constantly all of his young adult life.
As a teenager, he immerses himself in the teachings of a book called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, which instructs readers on proper manners, social behavior, and temperament. He commits them to memory.
In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers of feet. Lift not one eyebrow higher than the other, and bedew no man's face with your spittle by approaching too near him when you speak.
George Washington himself was very anxious to have all the right moves. He's as anxious as anyone as a teenager to get them right.
At 16, with only an elementary school education, he becomes a surveyor, where he learns how to navigate the wilderness, something that serves him well when he is appointed to the rank of major in the Virginia militia. In 1754, he leads a company of men into a territorial skirmish with French soldiers, where someone in his regiment, perhaps Washington himself, kills a French diplomat. Many believe his poor judgment starts a chain of events that leads to the French and Indian War. Despite his inauspicious start, Washington persists and eventually proves himself to be an exemplary officer. After the war, good fortune boosts Washington's ambitions. He marries a wealthy widow named Martha Custis and inherits his half-brother's estate, Mount Vernon, which he goes on to build into a plantation with more than 100 slaves. As part of the landed gentry, he goes into Virginia politics. Though he may feign unworthiness, there is no one in 1775 better equipped to take on the job of Commander-in-Chief.
Very importantly, he had been a political figure. For 16 years, he'd been a state legislator. So he was somebody who knew how to work with politicians, could work with Congress, and would not be a threat to Congress.
My dearest, it has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care.
Curiously, even when writing to Martha of his appointment, Washington is still pretending he doesn't want the job.
You may believe me when I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it.
What he can't avoid is destiny. He takes the job for no pay and prepares to leave for Boston to take on the strongest army in the world, not yet knowing that all hell has already broken loose up there in a place called Bunker Hill. May 1775. The rebels' capture of Fort Ticonderoga turns up the pressure on the already beleaguered British commander Thomas Gage. Back in the French and Indian War, 2,000 British soldiers lost their lives seizing Fort Ticonderoga, and now Gage has lost it to the Americans. In London, King George is furious that Gage's superior forces have failed to control the colonists.
I am of the opinion that when once these rebels have felt a smart blow, they will submit. And no situation can change my fixed resolution, either to bring the colonies to a due obedience or to cast them off. King George III.
No more reasoning, no more legislating. The colonies will come to their senses or face a show of force unlike any they have ever seen. Gage is dismissed. He is too weak, too tolerant. To replace him, the British command sends its 3 best generals to bring the colonies to heel. These are England's best and brightest military men, who become known as the Triumvirate of Reputation. General Henry Clinton, American-born, a competent soldier, but socially inept, a man referred to even by himself as a shy bitch. General John Burgoyne, vain and ambitious. One popular English writer gives him the nickname Julius Caesar Burgonius. And General William Howe, an experienced military man who came to appreciate America's British colonials while fighting alongside them in the French and Indian War.
These 3 supporting generals were brought in essentially to supplant Gage, and it became a kind of personal contest between these 3 men as to who would take Gage's position as commander-in-chief in America.
Howe is the odds-on favorite, but an odd choice to take over the command in America. A political liberal, he opposes the king's policies in the colonies and had once vowed not to fight against his English countrymen there.
General William Howe was opposed to the war. All they wanted was the Americans to submit to British laws and British taxes. They didn't want to go fight them.
Boston, June 16th. In the months since Lexington and Concord, rebel militia in the hills around Boston have laid siege to the city, trapping the British and their loyalists inside. Now the British command is planning to break the rebel stranglehold with an overwhelming offensive up Bunker Hill to take the high ground around Boston. But the colonials are a step ahead of the British. Spies have slipped the British plans to the rebels. Up in the hills, regimental commanders from Connecticut and Massachusetts lead their men to fortify Bunker Hill, then decide to move 1 hill closer to Boston on Breed's Hill. There, they dig in for a British attack. Midnight, June 17th. 1,200 militiamen race the clock to beat the sunrise before it reveals their position to the British below. They must control the high ground before the enemy makes its own move. At daybreak, the sleeping British ships in Boston Harbor spot the militia positions and sound the alarm. All of Boston awakens with a start. The Patriots have beaten the British to the punch. The first full battle of the Revolution is joined. As the Redcoats assemble for battle, ships in the harbor try to pin down the militia with cannon fire. Under the command of General William Howe, lines of British soldiers, their bayonets at the ready, climb the hill without any cover. Easy targets for a man and musket that can shoot straight.
The British are convinced that they can form up in line, and despite taking casualties, instill in the Patriots fear of a professional, disciplined force of regulars and demonstrate to the Americans that this is madness trying to oppose this army.
Twice, Howe's men charge up Breed's Hill. Twice, they are repelled by the militia. From roofs and hilltops, civilians come out to witness the bloodshed. It is war as spectator sport, but many fear for their loved ones in the fight. The rebel barrage goes on for 3 hours until they run out of ammunition. Despite their advantage, the rebels have no choice but to retreat. The British finally capture the hill on their third charge. But the ground is strewn with red-coated bodies. The new commander now realizes what no one in faraway England could possibly understand. This is not a rebellion. This is war.
When I look to the consequences of it, in the loss of so many brave officers, I do it with horror. The success is too dearly bought. British General William Howe.
The British pay a horrendous price for their victory at Breed's Hill, which erroneously but permanently becomes known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, after the original target. 1,000 of the 2,300 British soldiers, nearly half, are dead or wounded. The Americans lose 271 men out of 1,600. In defeat, the colonists have won. A paradox that over the next 6 years will come to characterize the Americans' bloody war for independence.
Bunker Hill was a defeat, of course, for these colonists, but they inflicted such heavy losses on the British that it makes them a little cocky. That was the best trained, most professional army on earth, and look at the damage we did to them. It really gives them way too much confidence.
In the days following the Battle of Bunker Hill, even as Congress begins to provide for a continental army, the delegates make one last attempt at reconciliation with Britain. They send the king what they call the Olive Branch Petition, respectfully requesting that he grant the North American colonies autonomy within the British Empire. Like all communication that crosses the Atlantic, it will take months for an answer, and General George Washington can't afford to wait to build his army. He alone holds the keys to liberty or to death. June 1775. As word of the valiant defense of Boston's Bunker Hill reaches Philadelphia, General George Washington writes a new will and heads off to meet his destiny. Whatever mortal fears Washington harbors, the people he meets on his way to Boston have no such misgivings about the man charged to defend them.
The appointment gives universal satisfaction. I was struck with General Washington. Dignity with ease and complacency, the gentleman and soldier look agreeably blended in him. Abigail Adams.
Cambridge, Massachusetts. Washington is in for a terrible surprise. Despite their brave defense of Breed's Hill, the men he is coming to command fail even his worst expectations.
He really has a task that is absolutely mind-boggling. We say that there was an army around Boston. There wasn't an army around Boston. There was a gaggle. These men are ragged, disheveled, getting drunk on duty, no knowledge of how to handle a musket efficiently. There was no discipline. There was certainly no hygiene, very little structure. It was a mess.
These are Washington's revolutionaries. This is the army he has to defend against the British Empire.
Whatever Washington may think of his soldiers as men and as citizens, as soldiers, they're not much use to him.
A dirty, mercenary spirit pervades the whole. Could I have foreseen what I have? No consideration upon earth should have induced me to accept this command. George Washington.
The general must start from scratch and personally attend to even the lowliest, most rudimentary functions.
His first tasks are fundamentally administrative tasks. His junior officers have to be taught how to fill out a report, how to count men, how to purchase supplies, how to buy tools, where to dig latrine, where to butcher meat, where to bury offal. These are all things that, amazingly enough, Washington has to concern himself with. So the task before him is immense, and it's going to require a tremendous amount of energy to literally whip this army into shape.
And the whip will come down hard. Every man will learn discipline by Washington's very strict code.
For disobedience of orders and damning his officer, to receive 30 lashes on his bare back. For expressing himself disrespectfully, to be stripped of his arms, put in a horse cart with rope round his neck, and drummed out of the army. General George Washington.
The new army is stitched together with widely different militias from very different colonies. Each is accustomed to its own command and its own way of doing things. Establishing a common culture is yet another overwhelming challenge.
There were so many different brands of fighting traditions, cultures, and people. Washington was very concerned that there were so many rivalries, so much friction between members of his army.
One of the Army's most serious problems is the utter lack of ammunition and gunpowder. When Washington is told that they have only 9 rounds of gunpowder per man, he is inconsolable. Advertisements in colonial newspapers plead for local gunmakers to step up their production, but to little avail. Perhaps no commander in history has ever faced so many obstacles to putting together a fighting force. And even if Washington succeeds, the effort may still be doomed. Most men have signed up for just 1-year enlistments.
These men are serving for very short terms. Most of them, their contracts expire either in November or December. They're only going to be around for a few months. So as soon as they become even remotely competent, they're going to go home and he's going to have a new group to train again.
Against these odds, Washington has precious little time to turn this woefully undisciplined, underprepared, and undersupplied army into a force that will have to stand up against the strongest army in the world. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. All the skill and experience in the world can't help British forces tame the chaos in the colonies. Thomas Gage now has only 7,000 soldiers, surrounded by Washington's 16,000.
The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. Small armies can't afford such losses. The rebels' number is great, so many hands have been employed. I wish this cursed place was burned. Thomas Gage.
October 11th, 1775. Without fanfare and without honors, General Thomas Gage is relieved of his command. Once Britain's most powerful man in America, he returns home alone and disgraced. General William Howe steps into Gage's boots and is already knee-deep in the American quagmire. In London, King George roundly rejects the Olive Branch Petition, Continental Congress's last grasp for peace. On October 26th, in his annual speech to Parliament, the king throws down the gauntlet.
It has now become the part of wisdom to put a speedy end to these disorders by the most decisive exertions. King George III.
What the king wants is a military solution to a political problem. But his call for war is anything but unanimous among Britain's people and politicians. But when Parliament votes, war carries the day. The military is ordered to send thousands more troops and a full armada to quell America's escalating revolution. Reinforcements can't come too soon for General William Howe. Hemmed in by the rebel siege, he and his army are virtual prisoners on the Boston Peninsula, along with 1,000 loyalists they're protecting. With no access to the countryside, they are unable to forage for food or wood. Supply ships from England have yet to arrive. The people in Boston are running out of provisions and fuel. Across the river in Cambridge, Washington is battling his own war of attrition. With the year about to come to an end, so will many enlistments, and short-timers will soon be leaving in droves. And now, Congress is pushing him to let go of some of his most loyal soldiers, African Americans. From the very beginning, free Northern blacks have been serving well the Patriot cause, with the same concerns as their white compatriots.
There was no militia unit that didn't have black men. They were at Bunker Hill, they were at Concord and Lexington and everywhere else. But recruiting black soldiers, that he had trouble with because the Continental Congress had trouble with it.
Now that the Army is a continental army, not just a local northern one, armed blacks have created a loaded issue in Congress. Southern states are adamantly opposed to making soldiers out of them. Washington is no different from any other Southern planter regarding blacks. He sounds like the Southern slaveholder he is when he issues his order banning black recruits.
The rights of mankind and the freedom of America will have numbers sufficient to support them without resorting to such wretched assistance. George Washington.
The great irony is that the one man closest to the general is a black man, his slave, Billy Lee. For the 7 years since Washington acquired him, Lee has been his master's valet and constant companion. Washington calls him my family.
Billy Lee was more than just a slave to George Washington. He was his personal slave. Billy Lee went with him every place.
If George Washington was the best horseman in Virginia, Billy Lee was the second best. And he and Washington would horseback ride just about every day.
And so the two of them presented quite a picture that was noticed over and over by people at the time who wrote about Washington and his male servant, Billy Lee.
You could say that Billy Lee, in fact, was a close friend of George Washington, even though he was a slave.
Washington and Congress's decision to reject black soldiers plays perfectly into the enemy's hands. The royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation that welcomes blacks to the British side.
I do hereby declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others that are able and willing to bear arms, free, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be. Lord Dunmore.
The Dunmore Proclamation wreaks havoc throughout Virginia. Thousands of slaves flee their masters for this chance at freedom.
If you have the opportunity to throw in your lot with people who are promising you a much better situation than you have had, you'd be silly not to take that promise seriously.
It was the best opportunity for freedom they had ever seen, and they never knew whether such an opportunity would ever present itself again.
You know, Thomas Jefferson estimates that in Virginia alone, 30,000 African Americans walked off to plantations, and many of them became British soldiers.
So for the British, this is wonderful. They're not only sapping the colonial economy by depriving it of slave labor, but they've added to their fighting force.
Free blacks travel secretly from plantation to embolden slaves to escape. If they are caught, they risk death or torture. While the fight for liberty in the South threatens to blow the slave culture apart, the approaching new year threatens to dissolve Washington's Northern Army.
We are now without any money in our treasury, powder in our magazines, arms in our stores, without a brigadier, engineers, expresses. By and by, when we shall be called upon to take the field, we shall not have a tent to lie in. I have often thought how much happier I should have been if, instead of accepting a command under such circumstances, I had taken my musket upon my shoulders and entered the ranks, or had retired to the back country and lived in a wigwam. George Washington.
All seems lost, even before it's begun, until a former bookseller has an idea that will change everything. January 1st, 1776. It's a new year for a new army, and General Washington raises a new flag to commemorate it, the Grand Union, with 13 stripes representing both the differences and common cause of the 13 colonies, and with the British Union Jack in the upper left to acknowledge those colonial leaders hoping to salvage a relationship with England. That same day, the colonies get the news of the King's October Proclamation to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. It's a stunning declaration by the King that rouses rebel ire more than ever. But an army needs more than anger to fight a war. With the onset of winter, neither side has the supplies necessary to brave the cold and snow. The British hole up in Boston, waiting for reinforcements and supplies from England, while Washington uses the time to piece together an army short on everything, from manpower to gunpowder. But help is on the way. Henry Knox, a 25-year-old colonel and former Boston bookseller, is leading a trek from Cambridge to Fort Ticonderoga on a quest for arms. Knox has taken it upon himself to recover the artillery captured from the British at Fort Ticonderoga. For 2 months, in the cold and wet, he, his men, and teams of oxen haul 120,000 pounds of artillery across 300 miles of muddy woods, frozen rivers, and steep, icy slopes back to headquarters in Cambridge. On January 25th, Colonel Knox delivers all of the weaponry to his commander-in-chief, miraculously intact. It is the best gift Washington could ever receive. Finally, he has the firepower he so badly needs. Washington also has in Knox a valued new commander in charge of artillery. Knox becomes part of Washington's inner circle of junior officers, whose counsel he values enormously.
George Washington always had the ability to listen to many people, particularly younger men. He thinks everybody's view is important, that it's a part of the puzzle, that people know things that he doesn't know, and if he can listen to enough opinions, he'll know as much as they do. A hallmark of good leadership.
Right away, Washington's brain trust keeps him from making a fatal mistake. As the spring thaw approaches, Washington wants to send waves of foot soldiers down into Boston in a full frontal attack. But his officers overrule him. The British are too well fortified, and the Continentals are still short of gunpowder. They do, however, have Knox's artillery. They decide to take the highest ground, Dorchester Heights, and bombard the city. March 2nd. After months of waiting, Washington and his men are more than eager to move. The general is about to launch the first offensive of his command. He sends a stern warning to his troops.
Our posterity depends upon the vigor of our exertions. If any man in action shall presume to skulk, hide himself, or retreat from the enemy without the orders of his commanding officer, he will be instantly shot down as an example of cowardice. General Washington.
The night of March 4th. Surprise will be the key. From 3 points outside the city, Cobble Hill, Lechmere, and Roxbury, the Army rains light cannon fire down on Boston. A decoy to misdirect the British, while the rest of the Army hauls Knox's artillery over to Dorchester Heights. Through the night, Washington's men build fortifications and drag cannon up the steep, frozen slope. By morning, everything is in place. Daybreak, March 5th. On the 6th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, the British awake to the sight of 20 cannon pointed down on their ships in the harbor. "My God," a shocked Howe exclaims, "these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months."
It's not until after they see Ticonderoga's guns on Dorchester Heights that they realize they got to get the heck out of there.
The Continentals don't even need to fire a shot. Howe issues a futile order for his ship's cannon to fire on the Continental position, but Washington's guns sit just out of range. Luckily for Howe, his ships are also out of Washington's range. Howe and his army prepare to abandon the city and take thousands of Loyalist citizens with them. One Loyalist would later write,
"The necessary care of the women, sick and wounded required every assistance that could be given. It was not like the breaking up of a camp, where every man knows his duty. It was like departing your country, with your wives, your servants, your household furniture, and all your encumbrances."
Over the next 2 weeks, the Continentals watch from above as all of Boston scrambles to evacuate, taking everything with them that isn't nailed down. It is a bitter exile for the Loyalists, many of whose families had lived in Boston for generations. By March 17th, they are all gone. 120 ships carry 9,000 redcoats, 2,000 Loyalists, and as many of the city's usable goods as possible, out to an unknown fate. The Patriots return to the city, the beloved birthplace of the rebellion, and Washington enjoys the first victory of his command. But it will be his last for the rest of a grueling and humiliating year. 1776 will see 33,000 British troops, the largest contingent ever sent overseas, head for America to grind the revolution into dust. April 1776. Fresh from their victories in Boston, the Continental Army marches overland toward New York. Having sent the British running, they are America's surprise heroes. Now 10,000 strong, a new notion gathers around them, an idea that will drive the warring British and American armies on a collision course. America wants independence. It will take George Washington and his citizen army everything they've got to win it. The heroes of Massachusetts, now riding high on confidence, have not even begun to taste the full power of the King's vengeance. The British are coming back, this time to deliver a more decisive blow. As they move toward New York by sea, they assemble an armada, the size of which the world has never seen. The British commander, General William Howe, fully understands his orders. What had begun in Massachusetts as an annoying insurgency is quickly becoming an expensive and embarrassing war. It is time to stop it.
Flushed with the idea of superiority after the evacuation of Boston, the Americans desire decisive action. Nothing is more sought for by us. General William Howe.
New York is the perfect place to end this rebellion, one way or another.
The importance of New York City is not lost to either William Howe or George Washington. Whomever controls New York City will control the Hudson River and by extension have the ability to sever the lines of communication between New England and the remaining colonies.
This was the grand strategy that was going to subdue the rebellion, that would break the colonies in half along this river, that would separate the cockpit of the revolution in Boston from the cockpit in Virginia, in New York, in New Jersey, and by that means bring about the collapse of the rebellion.
The conflict that has been fought militarily in Boston and politically in Philadelphia now comes to New York, a city already bitterly divided between loyalists and patriots. Each side, loyalist and patriot, is waiting for the great clash that will decide their fate. A British victory would likely end the war and return the colonies to the king. A continental win could set the colonies free. At stake, liberty. The word that has been in colonial ears since the outset of the year, when a slim pamphlet set America ablaze.
The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part."
Finally, someone has given the colonists a vocabulary of revolution. But who is the author? The words come anonymously from the most unlikely source. Not a leading American, but a young immigrant starting his life over in the New World. He comes from England with little money, scant education, and few prospects. But he carries powerful ideas from the European Enlightenment, ideas that, when planted in American soil, will grow into a revolution that will change the world. The author of this incendiary manifesto, Thomas Paine.
We don't have a statue of Paine. He's got to be the only founding father who has not been commemorated in marble and bronze because he was a true radical.
Young Tom Paine had never amounted to much in England, though he had tried his hand at everything. He had been a house servant, a merchant marine, and even a corset maker. In each of these pursuits, he would universally fail. Paine would discover himself in Philadelphia. Like many immigrants, it becomes his blank slate, his chance to start over. It is this same spirit Paine sees in America. Restless, searching, ambitious. The raw makings of a new world, without the burden of kings or powerful churches. It is a vision Paine turns into 46 simple pages, plain enough for every farmer, fishmonger, or founding father to understand. He calls it simply common sense.
We have it within our power to begin the world over again. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Now is the seed time of continental union.
Common Sense conjured up a vision of a very democratic America still to be, an America in the making.
The pamphlet quickly becomes a sensation, a best-selling how-to book on making revolution.
Some say 100,000 copies of this were published. Translate that into population rates today, that would be like selling 20 million books through Amazon or Barnes & Noble. That's an awful lot of communicating.
Colonists now contemplate the once unthinkable, breaking with the King of England. Thomas Paine has finally told them what to do. Begin a new world. Begin America.
The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth.
The army now swells with citizen soldiers ready to fight for Paine's ideals of a new world. Soldiers like Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins.
My dearest Sarah, I hope Providence will provide for us and carry me through all the troubles we have to meet in the way of our duty and while we are absent from each other.
A New England cobbler, 32-year-old Hodgkins had joined the army to protest colonial rule in his town of Ipswich, Massachusetts. Now he is pushing farther from his home, his tiny shoe shop, and his wife, Sarah.
I would not have you be uneasy about me. As I'm engaged in this glorious cause, I am willing to go where I am called.
Yet these citizen soldiers like Hodgkins present their own problem to General George Washington. Full of ideals, they lack training and experience. New York will be a battle on a scale none yet know against the full force of the greatest army in the world. Washington harbors doubts.
He had very rational fears. Any man of military experience would look at the task before them and realize this is not a foregone conclusion that we can achieve victory.
Victory or defeat will soon mean the future of America. The rebellion begun in Massachusetts over taxes is about to become a revolution for independence. June 1776. The debate over America's political future has been pushed to the forefront. What once was considered an act of mutiny and treason now becomes a real possibility, even a destiny. America is talking about liberty.
Suddenly, in every tavern, in every meeting house, everywhere people congregate, they're talking seriously about this idea. Should we go for independence or not? And they're talking about the ideas that Paine expresses. We have a grand, robust national dialogue, such as we've never had before or since, around a central theme that meant everything to everybody.
The British are intent on stopping it. Having gathered their strength, they arrive in New York Harbor in dramatic fashion. With 130 warships and nearly 25,000 men, they put on a show designed to scare even the most avid rebel.
When the British come in the summer of 1776, it's like Star Wars. It's the Empire Strikes Back. It's the Death Star.
These multiple acres and acres of white sail coming into the harbor must really have been a sight to behold. This is the most powerful military nation on earth that is bringing that power to bear on you.
At his headquarters in Lower New York, Washington has a front row seat.
The enemy will endeavor to intimidate by show and appearance. But remember that with so just a cause, victory is most assuredly ours. General George Washington.
Outwardly, Washington shows a calm face. Yet inside, he knows that defending New York will be the greatest test he has known. The Virginia farmer, turned rebel leader, is out of his league.
Washington was faced with a tremendous task He had no navy to speak of, and he was trying to protect a group of islands with hundreds of miles of shoreline against the world's most powerful naval force.
Miles away in Philadelphia, the reality of the situation is harder to take in. The great leaders of the Revolution, Ben Franklin, John Adams, John Hancock, see what they want to see: an army that has already stood up to the British. It pushes them to take the next step, the ultimate step, toward independence. A Virginia delegate, Richard Henry Lee, throws down the gauntlet.
Why do we longer delay? Why still deliberate? Let this happy day give birth to an American republic. If we are not this day wanting in our duty, the names of the American legislators of 1776 will be placed in posterity. Richard Henry Lee.
The time is now to make a declaration and commit it to paper. Congress turns to a young Virginia lawyer, a rising star in American politics. At 33 years old, Thomas Jefferson is the ideal American, bright, ambitious, and a gentleman.
Jefferson was a tall, slender, gentle, engaging man who wanted to be a scholar and never got a chance because he was such a good politician. Of all the revolutionaries, if I could sit with one at dinner, he'd be the one.
But Jefferson embodies America's deepest conflicts and contradictions. Having grown up on a wealthy Virginia plantation, he inherited aristocratic credentials and the 200 slaves to prove it. Yet Jefferson holds to an ideal America, a place of opportunity for everyone, a place where every American is in charge of his own fate. The child nation is growing up and longs to move beyond the shadow of its parent.
But they had grown up and they wanted an independent say about how their laws were made and who governed them. And Jefferson knew all of that. He knew that he wasn't writing anything that was revolutionary in the eyes of his own people, only in the rest of the world.
Mid-June 1776. Armed with these notions and a deadline of 2 weeks, Jefferson locks himself into a Philadelphia boarding house.
He sat in one room in the July sweltering heat of Philadelphia with the flies buzzing all about him, and he forgot all of that, and he just sat down and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote out of his head.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, the opinions of mankind impel them to the change. Thomas Jefferson.
It is a heady task for a fairly young mind. Every word must contain a reason to die for, every sentence an urgent cause to justify rising up against a king.
Think about it, the Declaration of Independence is a terribly radical document. That document says that if the government isn't treating you the way you think it should, and if you suffer this mistreatment over a period of time, you've got the right to rise up and destroy that government, to change it. That's a radical thing to say.
But Jefferson soon stumbles over the central question of the Revolution. It hangs in the hot air. Who will become a free American? In Britain, the elite legislated. Now, Jefferson's pen could reinvent all that. Would the new America mean rights for every man, woman, child, and even slave?
Who's in and who's out? Who's included? Does this mean everybody? Does this mean only the rich? Does this mean property holders? How far do we go? Who's included in this new nation?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Jefferson reaches for the highest ideals, but the contradictions of his words come back to haunt him.
All the talk about freedom and liberty, all of this reaches the ears of nearly 500,000 colonists who are black. That's 1/5 of the population.
Slavery already divides the colonies. Now, with the talk of independence, it takes front row. Some colonists draw the line at giving liberty to slaves. Others bristle at the hypocrisy of fighting for independence while sanctioning slavery. Jefferson himself remains divided. His own slaves watch their fates debated before them.
When Thomas Jefferson, incidentally the holder of over 100 slaves at this moment, wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." You don't think his slaves said, "Right on, John, right, right on, Thomas," that this is precisely what we want.
Many slaves choose not to wait. From cities and plantations across America, blacks begin an exodus. They flee.
On Washington's plantation, we know that 17 slaves ran. Stephen, 20 years old, a cooper by trade. Deborah, a 16-year-old woman. Peter, an old man. 23 fled from Jefferson. These people had made decisions. What's best for them? Patriot or loyalist didn't really matter. What's my best bet?
What does a man like Jefferson make of this when the slaves flee? Well, it throws in his face the notion of the enlightened slave master. And it comes upon him with great force, I think, if it hadn't before. That there's a fundamental contradiction in this whole revolution project between fighting for unalienable rights and holding slaves. He knew that.
Jefferson takes aim at slavery with scathing indictments of its wrongfulness. He puts them in his draft, yet falls short of calling for the end of slaveholding. Major battles are looming. Compromises must be made. In Philadelphia, his draft will soon be thrown to the varied interests in Congress. They will tear it apart. While in New York, the Continental Army prepares to put its life on the line for the dream of independence. Late June, 1776. While Congress works on independence in Philadelphia, 100 miles north on the bluffs of Brooklyn Heights, the Continental Army faces more urgent realities.
Put your backs into it, men.
They dig in for the fight to come. Every day they expect an attack. Every day it fails to arrive. Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins oversees the building of fortifications. But he grows tired of waiting.
My dear Sarah, I long to see you and my children, but when I shall is uncertain. General Washington is calling in the militia, and I hope we shall be in readiness to meet our enemy. Joseph Hodgkins.
While the Americans build fortifications, the British continue to pour into their camp on Staten Island. Throughout the summer, their force swells as the king sends more ships with more troops. Washington watches and waits. The impeccably cool gentleman from Virginia remains perplexed by the British, who gather strength but show no sign of attacking. Day after day, week after week, he can only sit and wonder.
Very unexpectedly to me, another revolving Monday is arrived before an attack upon this city, or a movement of the enemy. The reason of this is incomprehensible to me. General George Washington.
The flotilla of British ships bobs just off the tip of Manhattan, waiting for even more reinforcements, biding their time, wearing down rebel nerves. What Washington needs is a navy to stand up to the Goliath of the British Empire. What he gets is a slingshot, a tiny concept he hopes will have a huge impact. Its codename, the Turtle. It's the world's first combat submarine, designed to harass the world's mightiest navy. Made of oak, covered in tar, the tiny craft fits just one person. With a bicycle-like method, the engineer propels the vessel underwater. With a drill, he will fasten kegs of gunpowder and a fuse to his victim's hull. But the simple weapon is not simple enough. The Turtle will be used only once during the Battle of New York. At night, she sneaks up on the British flagship, the Eagle. But fastening the explosives to the hull proves too difficult. The Turtle is forced to make a hasty retreat, spotted and pursued by British longboats. The keg of gunpowder, the erstwhile torpedo, floats down the Hudson River, where it goes off by itself, harmlessly.
A giant column of water shot up as the bomb went off, and people on the shores were looking on in astonishment. But that was the end of the experiment.
It will be words, not bombs, that deliver Britain the strongest blows. July 1st, 1776. A draft of the Declaration is delivered to Congress. The delegates immediately tear into it.
The excruciating part took place after the document was written, and that was 3 days of debate in Congress, in which Congress took out 89 different things, including any language criticizing the practice of slavery. And Jefferson just sat there writhing through the whole thing.
The issue of slavery is left for another time.
There are flickers of doubt. They're bothered by it. They can't fix it. They kick it down the road. They basically postpone the problem to be reckoned with on another day. That day became the Civil War. It was a pretty bad day. But it's not that they're not bothered by it. They know it's wrong, they just don't know how to deal with it.
The pressure of time once again intervenes. On July 2nd, the matter of independence must be put to a vote. It passes.
The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable in the history of America. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. John Adams, Congressional Delegate.
Adams is a little off on the date, but close. 2 more days are necessary to hammer out the final declaration. On July 4th, independence becomes written fact. Within days, copies travel by horseback throughout the colonies. No one had set out to create a war of independence, yet they had delivered one.
In the town squares all over the country, church bells were ringing and people were huzzahing. The crowd was applauding. People really did believe the birthday of a new world is at hand.
These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. All political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved.
For those who had only imagined such a document, its realization is inspiring and sobering. The delegates who signed their names know they have just committed treason, a crime punishable by death.
All of our founding fathers, they think they're going to hang. We either hang together or hang separately. That was literal. They are outlaws. And if they fall into the hands of the British Army, they think they're going to swing from a tree.
It is the reckoning at the hands of King George that is on the minds of the signers, and for everyone across the colonies who supports independence. July 1776. Across the colonies, the reaction to the Declaration of Independence is deafening. For it or against it, it's clear that there is no turning back. It is a war that will make or unmake America.
The Declaration of Independence does change what the war is about. Up until that moment, the war had just been about forcing the British into a point where they'd be prepared to renegotiate the terms of membership in the empire. But after that moment, it's about getting the British to acknowledge independence.
In New York, patriots pulled down a statue of King George. It is a symbolic deed, but a useful one too. The lead is immediately sent off and melted down to make musket balls. 42,000 bullets will come out of fallen King George, and every one of them will be necessary. The battle they have been waiting for has arrived. July 12th, 3 p.m. The British unleash their guns. Only 8 days after the Declaration of Independence, the British answer with a barrage only the world's most powerful empire could muster. Soldiers and citizens alike freeze with fear.
A lot of these soldiers were 16, 17 years old, fresh off the farm. Some of these American soldiers were drunk in their cups, as the expression was. And so it was really kind of a disaster and a really inauspicious beginning to the battle for New York for the Americans.
George Washington is furious. The British have made clear their power. Now, inexplicably, they stop the attack. As quickly as the barrage comes, it ends. It is merely a show of force, a scare tactic by the British commander, General William Howe.
In fact, Howe's goal was not to win. It was to force the Americans to a conference table. It wasn't about inflicting crushing military defeat. It wasn't about humiliating the colonists. It was about showing them that British liberty was something worth having.
The British, having amply displayed their might, now counter with an invitation to talk peace. But Howe makes a small, yet costly, miscalculation. The message he sends is addressed simply to George Washington, a breach of protocol that is instantly recognizable.
The British are in a very difficult position. If they address the latter as His Excellency George Washington, Commander-in-Chief, they're effectively recognizing the legitimacy of the Continental Army. For Washington, this is a critical thing. He needs to be recognized. They are equals, after all. Howe commands an army, Washington commands an army.
The messenger and his various letters is rebuked several times. Finally, the letter is accepted. But by then, Washington wants no part of it. He sets aside the letter without opening it. The Americans will not consider negotiating.
So high is the vanity and the insolence of these men. Their leaders seem to risk everything, so that blows and war seem inevitable. Ambrose Searle, British Secretary.
August 12th, 1776. There will be no peace. Instead, the Continental soldiers will have to deliver America by war. The British might will soon return, but when and where remain a mystery. Joseph Hodgkins redoubles his efforts.
My dear Sarah, the posts are not going as quickly as I expected. It is thought this fleet will get all the strength they can before they make an attack on us. But we are awaiting and expecting them every day. Joseph Hodgkins.
This will be a different scale of warfare than these soldiers have ever known. On the eve of battle, some sit down to prepare their wills, aware that their first real battle with the British may also be their last. At their camp on Staten Island, the British are not nearly so nervous. Sure that victory is near, they bide their time enjoying the fruits of the American continent.
The fair nymphs of this isle are in wonderful tribulation, as the fresh meat our men have got here has made them as riders as satyrs. A girl cannot step into the bushes to pluck a rose without running the most imminent risk of being ravished. Lord Rawdon, British officer.
Their leader also takes full advantage of his time. Having taken one of his officers' wives for a lover, General William Howe lets the days slip by in his private conquests. George Washington can afford no such pleasures. Back in Manhattan, the general is losing his famous cool. As he waits, he guesses and second guesses every plan and every defense. He too is about to face the biggest battle of his life, and it will not be on his terms. It is the British who are running this show. Late August, Long Island, D-Day. On a warm August morning, Howe moves his army. More than 15,000 British soldiers now march toward the American positions. For the first time in the brand new War of Independence, the British will test the strength of the American army head on. The British attack first, with 2 columns taking the Continentals in a frontal assault. The 2 sides face each other in massive lines, often a mere 100 yards apart.
They gave everybody a couple of tots of rum just to get them liquored up enough to do this. The Americans didn't have that discipline. They didn't know it.
This is European-style warfare. For nearly all the Continentals, it is their first taste of it.
A person in the 20th or 21st century looks at those linear battle formations of the 18th century as they seem to be struck by the stupidity of these things. But really, these tactics and these formations are predicated upon the state of technology at the time.
In open field battles and in smaller forest skirmishes, the Americans struggle to hold their own. What they don't know is that they are fighting a decoy. The bulk of Howe's army is actually a third flank, marching out and around the American forces. Washington has not prepared for this. By 10 a.m., the British break through the rear ranks and devastate the lines of the Continental Army.
The worst possible thing that can happen in those situations is to have a complete rupturing of your line, a complete break in which men panic and everybody flees basically for themselves. It is, without a doubt, the most demoralizing, disheartening sort of experience that these soldiers could have possibly felt.
The rebel army, in a state of panic, flees. Among them, the young Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins. He watches his soldiers break, a sight he will never forget.
Loving wife, in the woods and in the night, the enemy marched out 2 different ways. We were obliged to go through fire and water. It seems the day is come that in all probability depends the salvation of this country. Joseph Hodgkins.
The army straggles back, minus the 300 dead and 1,000 captured. George Washington watches in shock. His army had not withstood the battle. He had failed, and the danger is far from over. At Brooklyn Heights, the army is trapped on all sides. The British Navy commands the waterways to the west. From the east and south, Howe's army closes in on the shattered Continental defenses. All looks lost, but the end would not come just yet. In a last effort to save his army, Washington orders an immediate retreat to start at nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, the army begins to move, stealthily, using every ferry and fishing boat available to them. All through the night, soldiers are ferried across a narrow slip between Brooklyn and Manhattan. They soon run out of time, but they get one final providence. As morning breaks, a strange and eerie fog sets in over New York Harbor, engulfing the area in a near blackout. It is their salvation. The British see and hear nothing.
I could scarcely discern a man at 6-yard distance. In the history of warfare, I do not recollect a more fortunate retreat. Benjamin Talmadge, Continental officer.
When the fog lifts, the British are met with an empty camp. The Continental Army, just hours before on the verge of defeat, has vanished overnight.
The failure to capture them and to really put a stop to the war by rounding up the rebel forces really was perhaps one of the greatest blunders of the war, because it was in New York with the greatest armada, the greatest number of men that they had at any time during those 8 years. The British lost their best opportunity to win the war at a stroke.
The remains of the rebel army recuperate. Dispirited and defeated, they can only wonder what will happen next. Having made it off of Long Island with the others, Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins now has a moment to communicate with his wife, Sarah. Her words are those of many back home across the colonies, a mixture of immediate fears and distant hopes.
My dear husband, I desire to be thankful that you have got off of Long Island. I think things look very dark on our side, but it has been observed that man's extremity was God's opportunity. Sarah Hodgkins.
George Washington is wrecked. He has come within inches of losing his entire army, and along with it, the cause of independence. Now he knows he must abandon New York City. The Continental Army is in no shape to fight again. They leave the city and go north along Manhattan Island. A few months ago, they were being treated as heroes. Now they are in full retreat. Washington's reputation has plummeted too. His inexperience and mistakes had been costly. His ability to lead an army is now severely in question. Soon, he will receive challenges from within his own ranks.
If you stopped the clock in 1776, you would have suspected that this guy would be out of a job pretty soon. Things were not going well.
The dream of a new world, Thomas Paine's vision, seems more remote with each step. Across America, spirits are depleted. Many soldiers up and leave the army. Others, like Joseph Hodgkins, face the choice: stay and fight, or return to their homes, perhaps as British subjects evermore.
My dear Joseph, I hope if we live to see this campaign out, we shall have the happiness of living together. It will trouble me very much if you should engage again. Your most affectionate companion until death, Sarah.
Hodgkins will stay and retreat with the remains of the army toward an uncertain future for himself, for the army, and for the cause of independence. The revolution will go on, but it is about to enter its darkest days. September 1776, New York. The rebel army is in retreat, pursued by the British up the Isle of Manhattan. In battle after battle, the colonial army is sent running, overwhelmed by the British forces and their superior power. The two sides engage at Kips Bay, then up Manhattan at Harlem Heights, and again north in White Plains. Only one lone American outpost prevents the total loss of New York and control of the Hudson River: Fort Washington, a garrison named after His Excellency George Washington himself. And now it is under a massive attack. George Washington watches the terrifying scene from just across the Hudson River. His last hold on New York is fading fast. Nearly all of his officers had recommended abandoning it. Fort Washington was not built to defend itself against such a sizable British onslaught. The Continental soldiers prepare themselves for a last stand, but they are in no shape for heroics. A month of steady defeats have left them exhausted. And now, again, they are outnumbered. 3,000 of them against 8,000 royals. It was Washington's most trusted general, Nathaniel Greene, who had convinced the commander to defend the fort. Greene, a young and talented Rhode Island officer, had, over time, become Washington's most trusted confidant. But this time, following his advice is a disastrous error in judgment for the rebel leader.
Nathaniel Greene opines that he can hold that fort with the men he has available to him, and he recommends that course of action to Washington. Washington trusts this very capable and energetic subordinate, and Greene was wrong.
The British army is unstoppable. Not only do they have the numbers, they put their big guns out in front. They unleash a fierce battalion of German fighters called the Hessians. The Hessians are unmistakable. From their armored helmets to their expertise with the bayonet, they are a near mythical vision from the old world. England has used foreigners for centuries to help fight their wars. But in America, the Hessians create a new specter. At once feared and hated, they are seen as outsiders in a conflict between brothers. They quickly gain a reputation as detested mercenaries.
The Hessians did not regard themselves as engaged in a civil war, and wherever the German mercenaries went, oftentimes there were allegations of all sorts of brutality, ranging from sexual violence to stealing of supplies.
These European fighters have been trained under a different set of ethics than the colonial army, an almost medieval sense of warfare. Plucked from society's cast-offs and often pressed into service against their will, the Hessian soldiers are ruthlessly drilled into fighting machines. Their rewards, when they receive them, come in the form of pride and a fair share of whatever plunder they can get their hands on. In America, they sang songs about their chance for treasure.
Go with us to America. There will be enough for all. There will be silver, gold, and money. Everything that a man seeks in the world, all that a man seeks there, is in America.
Essentially, the Hessians operated according to a code that made sense in Germany, but was very different from anything that Americans had been familiar with.
On this day, the Hessians earn their worth. They lead the British in overwhelming Fort Washington in mere hours. By afternoon, the rebels lay down their weapons. Fort Washington is surrendered, and along with it, New York. The two sides now face each other up close. The King's Army and their hired warriors get their first chance to gaze upon the faces of the exhausted rebel army they have pursued for months. It is a sight that leaves them shocked.
A great many of them were lads under 15 and old men, and few of them had the appearance of soldiers. Their odd figures frequently excited the laughter of our soldiers. Captain Frederick Mackenzie, British officer.
The King's men had been fighting a wretched army, a band of citizens with little training. As the smoke clears over the dead and wounded, an amazing sight takes both sides by surprise. A young woman sits by her dead husband's side, but she had not been an idle bystander. When John Corbin fell from wounds, Molly Corbin stepped up to the cannons, firing on the British with the rest of the patriots. The British quickly send Molly Corbin home. There, after the war, she will die in obscurity. But on this day, the rebels will not forget the woman who evoked their cause. If this war is to persist, every citizen, man, woman, and child, will be called upon.
I feel mad, vexed, sick, and sorry. This is a most terrible event. Its consequences are justly to be dreaded. General Nathanael Greene.
Half the army is captured at Fort Washington. New York and control of the mighty Hudson falls squarely into British hands. Some begin to wonder whether the rebels can actually deliver an independent America.
I was never in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born. I am wearied to death. General George Washington.
The Americans in 1776 have encountered nothing but reverses. It's defeat followed by defeat, withdrawal followed by withdrawal. This really negatively affects the morale of his force, and perhaps more importantly, affects the morale of some of his subordinate commanders, who really now question whether or not Washington is the right man for this job.
Between us, a certain great man is most damnably deficient. He has thrown me into a situation where I have my choice of difficulties. General Charles Lee.
Some of Washington's own generals now take their aim at his reputation. Washington and the army, at their weakest and most vulnerable, will soon have to face another battle. A power struggle at the very top. The revolution is about to stumble. November 1776. George Washington's Continental Army is in full retreat across New Jersey. he has just lost New York, and with it, half his army. Washington cannot afford another confrontation. Hundreds had died. Many thousands more had been taken as prisoners of war. Enemy captives are not something the British had planned for in this rebellion. Now they are forced to confront the problem.
After the defeat in New York, the British find themselves holding more American prisoners than they know what to do with. And so they're going to use the Sugar Hut and a number of other large structures that can quickly be made secure. They're also going to use prison ships.
Of all the places of internment, the ships quickly become the most notorious. Thousands are thrown into the holds of decommissioned warships. There, with inadequate food, hygiene, and air, disease runs rampant. Starvation is common. Being here is almost worse than a quick death on the battlefield.
Some of these ships would have 1,000 men, 1,000 prisoners, and perhaps a dozen a day would be taken out dead and buried in the shallow graves on the sandy shores of Brooklyn.
I now found myself among a collection of the most wretched and disgusting-looking objects that I ever beheld in human form, now shriveled and surrounded with the horrors of sickness and death. Here, thought I, must I linger till death should terminate my sufferings. Ebenezer Fox, prisoner.
To the British, these men are not just prisoners of war, they are traitors. Yet their punishment will not be swift. Instead of an executioner's hand, these rebels will be left to rot. Along Washington's retreat, there is no time for sympathy. No one knows what lies ahead for them. It is a minor consolation that they have become experts in at least one aspect of the military.
I can only say that no lads ever showed greater activity in retreating than we have. Our soldiers are the best fellows in the world at this business. Colonel Samuel Webb, Continental Officer.
With retreat comes more recrimination, this time from within Washington's own ranks. General Charles Lee is among those who revel in Washington's failures and secretly scheme against him. In late November of 1776, Lee steps up his campaign for the commander's job. Like Washington, Lee is ambitious for glory, but their similarities end there. Where George Washington has a famous grace, Charles Lee has an infamous coarseness.
He was a slob. He didn't wash. He always had a pack of dogs going everywhere with him. He consorted with low women. He was not a gentleman. A corporal's wife would be his preference.
Yet as a general, his prowess is undeniable, even intimidating. He had, after all, learned his skills in the best army in the world, the British.
Lee is arguably the most qualified general officer in the American Army in a strictly military sense. He fought in the French and Indian War, he fought in continental Europe during the 7 Years' War, he fought from Russia to Poland. He's exceptionally experienced, but this experience breeds some hubris. He thinks that he knows better.
Passed over for promotion in England, Lee jumped ship for America, only to find himself subordinate to George Washington. Now, Lee's sense of self-worth pushes him toward betrayal once again. This time, he wants what he deserves: command of the Continental Army.
I foresaw all that has happened. Had I the powers, I could do much good.
Confidence in General George Washington is at an all-time low. Lee's chance is at hand. Late November 1776. The two generals now lead regiments in separate retreats. Washington through the center of New Jersey with the main army. Lee north with a regiment of 4,000. As they move, Lee corresponds with all those who might be sympathetic to his personal cause. These include a once faithful adjutant to Washington, a certain Colonel Joseph Reed.
Dear General Lee, I do not mean to flatter or praise you at the expense of any other, but I do confess it is entirely owing to you that this army is not totally cut off.
Reed, too, encourages a change in leadership.
We are in an awful and alarming situation. I think yourself and some others should go to Congress to form the plan of the new army. Joseph Reed.
Charles Lee has just such ambitions, and lets many in Congress and the Army know it. Only George Washington himself remains unaware of the plot at hand. That is about to change.
Washington, by accident, opened a letter from Charles Lee to Joseph Reed, and it was clear that the two men had been discussing Washington's fatal indecision of mind.
My dear Reed, I lament with you that fatal indecision of mind, which in war is a much greater disqualification than stupidity, or even want of personal courage. Eternal defeat must attend the men of the best parts, if cursed with indecision. General Charles Lee.
Washington's response was to write to Reed and say, I opened this by accident, I thought it was official business, and to just try to smooth it over. I think all of these moments really just highlight the extraordinary kind of equilibrium that he maintained.
Washington lets it pass. But he can have no doubt that his own power is weakening. His errors in New York are becoming widely known, and those who once threw their support behind him, the Army, and the cause of independence are now compelled toward doubt. A sense of doom gathers across America.
Washington is devastated by his defeats. This public relations disaster means that the people don't support the Army. They're back to maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't try a revolution.
It is the opportunity the British have been waiting for. Into this vacuum of power and the flagging spirit for rebellion, they issue a proclamation. They offer leniency to those who pledge allegiance to the king. Those who will not shall be considered traitors.
Every American had to choose. Do I support the patriots? Do I support the loyalists? Is there any neutral ground between them? How do you make this choice? People are not only making this choice according to their political beliefs or whether they, really respect the king or not. They're often making this choice according to what's best for them.
The soul of the revolution is now up for grabs. Who will come out ahead? General Charles Lee, George Washington, or the British Army? What each does next will determine the outcome. America's revolution hangs in the balance. December 1776. British are gaining control of New Jersey, yet they find a populace unwilling to support them. With their massive army, food and supplies are critical to their efforts. Out of need and a hint of vengeance, the British turn to more forceful methods. They take what they need by whatever means necessary. It is a bitter taste of what America might look forward to under full British military occupation.
They have taken hogs, sheep, horses, and cows everywhere. Even children have been stripped of their clothes. In short, the abuse of the inhabitants is beyond description. Charles Wilson Peel, American soldier.
Soon the Hessian mercenaries join the fury, cutting their own path of plunder across the colony. Along with them, stories of brutality spread far and wide, allegations of torture, rape, and murder. Such acts become a rallying point around which to sway colonists against the British. Patriot newsprint quickly takes full advantage.
They stripped them of their cash and clothes, poor creatures. Many of them died. The devil's not more cruel.
It was a huge propaganda coup for the colonists, who were able to isolate a few incidents of Hessian brutality and atrocities and project that as par for the course. It helped muster more support for the revolution and demonstrated to the Americans the extreme lengths to which the British were willing to go to put down this insurrection.
The British had aimed to bolster loyalty in New Jersey. Instead, their actions stir up an infuriated population. Patriots and loyalists now take up arms against one another as the War of Independence descends into anarchy and civil strife. Washington can sense the mounting chaos. Both sides, loyalist and patriot, seem to have given up on the cause of the revolution.
As Washington flees across New Jersey and people are unwilling to help him, he fully realizes that this revolution might be over. He's a commander-in-chief of an army that has shrunk drastically. He's on the run with the enemy on his heels. Congressmen write their wives and their friends letters saying that the game is just about up. They're fearful that this war is shortly going to be over.
Washington turns his focus toward Philadelphia, around which he will try to build a defense. But General Charles Lee's troops are still 50 miles north. Without them, Washington's numbers are inadequate. Like it or not, he needs Lee. Lee has other plans, and they don't include helping Washington. He ignores the commander's almost daily pleas to rejoin the main army.
December 1. Dear Sir, the enemy are advancing, and from information not to be doubted, mean to push to Philadelphia. I must entreat you to hasten your march as much as possible, or your arrival may be too late to answer any valuable purpose. General George Washington.
Technically, Washington could have ordered Charles Lee to do what he wanted.
Dear Sir, having wrote you fully both yesterday and today of my situation, you will readily agree that I have sufficient cause for my anxiety and to wish for your arrival as early as possible.
Perhaps Washington thought that with a loose cannon like Lee, perhaps the best way was not force, but to cajole him into seeing things the same way.
Friday the 13th, 1776. General Charles Lee has no intention of coming to Washington's aid. Instead, he stops his retreat and takes residence in a comfortable tavern. There, Lee makes his final move. It won't be a good one. Lee works over his correspondences denigrating George Washington. Yet he remains unaware of the scene just outside his window. British scouts have tracked Lee to the tavern and will take him by surprise.
The scene was almost comical if it hadn't been so tragic. Lee was surrounded by a British cavalry in his dressing gown, slippers basically.
Lee puts up no fight. In one brazen and sloppy moment, his campaign for leadership of the Continental Army comes to an abrupt halt. London celebrates the capture. The traitor Lee, some say, is the only rebel general they had cause to fear. Even the stock market goes up on the belief that this is the coup that will end the war. But Washington is not so easily fazed. A political rival out of the way, and his absent troops now marching toward him, Washington regains his sense of mission. His own officers, like General Nathanael Greene, take notice.
His Excellency, George Washington, never appeared so much advantage as in the hour of distress.
Again, it falls to Washington to turn the fortunes of the war, if it isn't too late. New Jersey is now a battlefield, not only for the two armies, but for the colonists themselves. Amidst the tension, citizens weigh their loyalties. Should they side with the fleeing Continentals or with the British occupiers, whose very presence has created fresh hostility in the colony?
And this is what happens, right, when you put military men in the charge of what is also a delicate political operation. And in this respect, I think one has to be a little sympathetic to the British government. Putting down an anti-imperial, anti-colonial uprising is not something anyone had much experience with in the 18th century.
As winter sets in, both sides retrench. The British occupy more of New Jersey by spreading smaller units throughout the territory. Washington, meanwhile, escapes into Pennsylvania, where he hopes to prevent an attack on Philadelphia, the seat of Congress. Mid-December 1776. The mood of despair has crept into his own soldiers as well. Many simply decide it is time to go home. Faith in the revolution is falling as fast as the temperature.
It's been a wretched year for them. Conditions have been harsh. Smallpox has broken out in the army. That's in addition to the other camp diseases that ravage the army at regular intervals. Militarily, things have been disastrous. There's not a lot of incentive for them to stay.
One man watches in horror. Thomas Paine had joined Washington's army as one of the Revolution's first war correspondents. Now, the young author of Common Sense, who helped spark independence only a year earlier, knows he must once again take up his pen. This time, he will not aim his words at the enemy, but directly at the hearts of American patriots.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. Thomas Paine.
With a sense that the war rides as much on his words as on the musket ball, Paine rushes to Philadelphia to print his new manifesto. There, Paine finds his hometown in chaos. Fear and rumor are spreading like a virus. Citizens are convinced that Washington's forces won't be able to defend Philadelphia. In response, people flee. A steady stream of Philadelphians take their belongings and head elsewhere, leaving their empty homes and closed-up shops to the British, if they should come. The citizens are not alone. Continental Congress and all its members have evacuated too, heading further south to Baltimore. Against this backdrop, Thomas Paine gets to work. In a span of 10 days, the young author and printer, the man who arrived in America only a few years ago full of hopes to begin a new world in these raw colonies, sets his thoughts to print. He titles it American Crisis. As quickly and widely as Common Sense had spread, so too does this book. It begins to work its magic instantly.
What we obtain too cheap we esteem too lightly, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Thomas Paine.
This was really the low point for the Americans. Washington's reputation was really at stake, and with that reputation, the ability to round up fresh recruits for the army. So it was a really do-or-die moment in New Jersey.
Paine's words only go so far. Washington must alter his entire approach to the war. He must make some bold move that will restore faith in him and in the durability of the revolution.
He makes up his mind, I've got to shift tactics. He thinks that it isn't necessary to win the war on the battlefield. He just can't lose it. The most important thing is to keep the army together. At the same time, back home, convincing the mothers and wives and children of British soldiers that the cost of this war is too high in deaths, casualties, and for Parliament too, in money.
For the British commander, William Howe, things are not going as planned. The occupation of New Jersey has spread his forces thin. In London, people are asking why the war is not yet won. He needs time to think. Howe has his army dig in for the winter. To guard against rebel attacks, he places Hessian forces at key junctions along the Delaware River, places like Burlington and Trenton. As the cold sets in, the British expect to catch their breath before the next season of fighting begins. Howe's command along the Delaware River falls to Hessian Colonel Johann Rall. Rall has been on constant alert, but now, holed up in Trenton, he is finally beginning to relax. An attack is unlikely as the weather turns grim, and a blizzard blows outside his window. Rall lets his guard down and waits for reinforcements, due any moment. Christmas Eve, New Jersey. Rall's Hessian reinforcements have made an unscheduled stop. Their commander, Colonel von Donop, has decided to spend the night with a fair widow in Mount Holly, just 20 miles from Trenton.
The colonel, who was exceedingly devoted to the fair sex, had found the beautiful young widow of a doctor. He wanted to set up rest quarters in Mount Holly, which, to the misfortune of Colonel Rall, he was permitted to do. Captain Johann Ewald, Hessian officer.
Von Donop's rest will have consequences he cannot imagine, and history will soon record the contribution to the revolution made by the mysterious widow of Mount Holly, whose identity will never be known. Some believe she may have been Betsy Ross, the future creator of the American flag. Scouts soon report to Washington that the Hessian army has left its defenses down. Washington hatches his plan. He will attack. It may well be his last shot, a final effort to revive his reputation, the spirit of his soldiers, and the survival of the revolution. In the last cold days of 1776, Washington prepares his army for what may be the final gambit in the War of Independence. Few believe he can still be victorious. His own soldiers regularly leave the army as their commissions come up. An urgency creeps into everything and everyone.
We are all of the opinion, my dear General, that delay is now equal to a total defeat. Some enterprise must be undertaken in our present circumstances, or we must give up the cause. Joseph Reed, Continental Officer.
By the time Christmas of 1776 approaches, everything has bottomed out. His army has shrunk to only about 5,000 men. He's lost the support of a lot of the people, and all appears to be lost. It truly is a do-or-die situation.
Washington makes a bold decision. He will strike the enemy at Trenton. On Christmas Day, Washington tells his army to prepare. After months of defeat and loss, they understand his purpose. The army will now take the offensive. They will be crossing the Delaware back to New Jersey. Shortly before departing, Washington has American Crisis read aloud.
Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and to repulse it. Time hath found us. Thomas Paine.
It will be a monumental task. Washington's men must ford a near-frozen river in a blizzard and get across fast enough to take the enemy before dawn by surprise. Yet Washington's leadership, his army, and the revolution all ride on the success of this singular mission. Washington himself will lead the soldiers into battle for the first time in the war. The general knows that if they fail, there will be no more chances. At 11 p.m., the boats begin to cross. It will be harder than they had even imagined.
Every school child in America is familiar with the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, when he's boldly in the front of the boat, standing up, looking heroically towards the eastern shore of the river. It would have been nice, but it didn't happen like that. Nobody stood up that night, wisely so.
It was as severe a night as I ever saw. The frost was sharp, the current difficult to stern, the ice increasing, the wind high, and at 11 it began to snow. It was only with the greatest care and labor that the horses and artillery could be ferried over the river. Captain Thomas Rodney, Continental officer.
It takes most of the night to get the army over. It costs them severely in time. As dawn approaches, this surprise attack on the Hessian forces at Trenton grows nearly impossible. For a moment, Washington considers turning back.
It made me despair of surprising the town, as I well knew we could not reach it before the day was fairly broke. I determined to push on at all events. General George Washington.
5 a.m. The weather worsens and the temperatures drop even further. The soldiers, some with only rags on their feet, begin to succumb to the elements.
I was so benumbed with cold that I wanted to go to sleep. Had I been passed unnoticed, I should have frozen to death without knowing it. But as good luck attended me, Sergeant Madden came and made me walk about. John Greenwood, Continental Fifer.
Not all are so lucky. 2 soldiers lay down in the snow, never to get up again. The others press on. Everything now depends on speed and stealth. It is Washington's new way of waging war.
If he's victorious, fine. If he's defeated, escape as fast as you can and keep your army together. Move fast. Sneak attacks, surprises, midnight escapes, any trick a magician could pull out of his hat. That's how he's got to fight.
Washington had learned his lessons the hard way. Now he will change the rules. In a swift move, he catches the Hessians off guard. It sets off a fierce battle. Hessian soldiers scramble to grab their muskets and meet the enemy. Colonel Rahl wakes up to a battle already underway. He had been expecting something from the rebels, but nothing of this scale. Nor is this the same army the Hessians once met in New York. Now the Continentals fight with fierce spirit. In bloody, chaotic engagements, they hold their own. Trenton is a small battle in numbers, but it is a vicious and closely fought one.
Battle of Trenton is a brutal encounter. The Americans surprise the Hessians, who tumble out of their barracks, grab their muskets, and attempt to defend themselves. The battle lasts less than an hour, though. The Hessians don't have a chance because they're surprised.
Here conceived a scene of war of which I had often conceived, but never saw before. The hurry, the fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump shall sound. Colonel Henry Knox, Continental officer.
In the midst of the fighting, the Hessian Colonel Rahl is shot twice. As he dies in bed, the leaderless Hessians lose their will to go on. The path that had taken them from victory in New York ends with defeat at Trenton. 1,000 Hessians are captured or killed out of only 1,500 present. It is Washington's day. Trenton sends a resounding message. The Continental Army is back, and Washington is their undisputed leader. In a year of hardships and loss, he has now learned how to fight this war.
Trenton illustrates the genius of George Washington. Here is an opportunity to strike the enemy where he's weak, when he's weak. This is going to establish the pattern for the rest of the war, in which the Continental Army will always live to fight another day, pick low-hanging fruit, frustrate the British, and continue to provide a thorn in the side of the different British commanders.
Yet Washington faces one more challenge before 1776 is over. December 31st marks the last day of many soldiers' commissions. Many, if not all, are eager to return to their citizen lives.
At the end of December, a lot of enlistment terms run out. Those men want to go home. He goes back onto the field, and he tells them, as heartfelt as he can, that you've done everything that America could ask of you. You've risked your lives, you've been in fierce encounters, and now I'm asking you to do it just one more time. And he waits, and nobody moves.
The men have given all they can. Now it is Washington's turn. To anyone who will re-enlist, Washington makes an offer of an additional $10 pay, more than a month's salary.
My brave fellows, you have done all I have asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake. We know not how to spare you. General George Washington.
And then one soldier grumbles, well, I might as well keep fighting. He steps forward. Then others follow him. And eventually a little bit more than half the men in the army stay for the $10. But he doesn't have the $10.
Washington writes to Congress to request the emergency funds. For this trifling sum, the army holds together and grows as news of Trenton brings new recruits. At the very end of this dark year, Washington has revived the revolution.
Through most of the fall, there have been a number of officers who thought they could do his job better than he could, and a number of members of Congress who thought the same. That changes after Trenton. That criticism evaporates, at least for a while. And it seems that the tide has turned. At least the army is going to continue to exist. And the army is the revolution.
1776, the year America is born, and a grueling test for the new nation. Liberty is embraced, and then very nearly lost. Washington has saved the revolution, but the biggest battles still lie ahead. With cautious optimism, a friend of George Washington writes him a New Year's card. The year 1776 is over. I am heartily glad of it, and hope neither you nor America will be plagued with such another. December 1776. At a secret location along the French coast, a shipment is being prepared. Rifles, uniforms, gunpowder, and ammunition are crated and boarded, bound for America. It is a gesture of solidarity from France against their common enemy, Great Britain. The weapons will aid Washington's notoriously undersupplied army, which has just unleashed a Christmas surprise on the British. The Battle of Trenton has bolstered the rebels. But America needs more than supplies to turn the tide of war. What General George Washington really needs is money and a navy. In pursuit of this goal, the Americans have sent their own secret weapon to France. He arrives on a crisp December morning along the French coast. He is old and frail, with a variety of ailments. But Benjamin Franklin is also the most famous revolutionary leader in Europe. Franklin is the man who tamed lightning, a renowned scientist, inventor, and writer who brought the simple wisdom of Poor Richard to the world.
When Franklin gets to France, there's an enormous sense of consternation. What is this figurehead? What is this great celebrity doing here? And remember, given the way the media worked in those days, he washes up on the shores of Brittany with no announcement, and there are all sorts of wonderful rumors afoot as to what he's doing in France. He's come to buy himself a chateau with his immense fortune. He's come to educate his grandsons in Europe because the schools are better. Every possible idea is put forth. The idea that he's actually there to enlist the French in this cause is not the obvious conclusion. And he doesn't feel he has to illuminate anyone.
Franklin arrives into a deeply divided nation, no place more so than Paris itself. The wealthy live in opulence, while the poor walk on city streets ankle deep in waste and excrement. This dichotomy has produced new thinking about Europe's age-old system of class. The French read Thomas Paine and cheer America's revolution. As one Frenchman noted, there is 100 times more enthusiasm for this revolution in the Paris cafes than in the colonies. Franklin plays on this enthusiasm. Now, in one of the most opulent courts in Europe, the home of Marie Antoinette, Franklin presents a simple yet carefully crafted portrait of America and all things American.
Picture me very plainly dressed, wearing my thin gray straight hair that peeps out from under my only coiffure, a fine fur cap which comes down to my forehead almost to my spectacles. Think how this must appear among the powdered heads of Paris. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin plays on this romance. He dresses very plainly, he wears a beaver cap, and he becomes kind of a fad. The women love to be around Franklin. They think there's something kind of very romantic about this backwoodsman who's here in their midst.
Before long, all the fashionable women are wearing their hair in a style that mimics Franklin's fur cap. They call the style à la Franklin. But not all quarters are equally charmed. December 28, 1776. Ben Franklin arrives at Versailles, home to King Louis XVI.
It seems like a fool's errand when you think about it. Franklin is sent to an absolute monarchy to ask them to fund a revolution against a king. But the truth is that the animus on the French part against the English is so great that this is a very easy argument to make.
Franklin is greeted by France's foreign minister, the crafty Comte de Vergennes. Vergennes is the one behind France's covert arms shipments.
anyone in his right mind would have assumed that the best thing to do would have been to let the colonies and England destroy each other mutually and not to intervene. But he is dead set on revenge. It's the one thing he needs to accomplish. And he could not be more eager.
He is intrigued by the revolution, but France needs to know they are backing a winner. Franklin's attuned sense of gamesmanship tells him the time is not right. That, and the fact King Louis XVI refuses to meet with him. But without France, the threadbare American Revolution is in peril. For now, Franklin will have to wait and pin his hopes on events 3,000 miles away, where only a great American victory could budge the French. But that couldn't seem less likely. Back in New Jersey, the Continental Army is in bad shape. The Americans have not yet figured out how to feed and supply the army. John Adams, the always outspoken member of Congress, complains,
"Our army is an object of wretchedness enough to fill a human mind with horror. Disgraced, defeated, discontented, dispirited, diseased, naked, undisciplined, eaten up with vermin. No clothes, beds, or blankets. No medicines, no victuals but salt pork and flour."
And as winter turns to spring, the problems only worsen. No one is joining the army, and officers sent on recruiting missions must dig deeper to fill the quotas for new recruits.
The colonists, like every generation before or after, seem convinced that the war is going to be over by Christmas. When the war isn't over by Christmas, Washington has a hard time recruiting soldiers. And it's in 1777 that we see many states beginning to offer significantly increased bounties. That's a cash payment for enlistment. Service in the Continental Army is now offered as an alternative to corporal punishment when you're brought into court. Service in the Continental Army is encouraged for vagrants.
The shortages of trained soldiers hits the Army hard. No place more than the northern American outpost of Fort Ticonderoga, where America's inexperienced recruits are about to become the target of a major British attack. America's envoy in Paris, Benjamin Franklin, has made his first overtures to the French, an attempt to get the European power to join in the fight against their age-old enemy, England. But for now, the elder statesman has come away empty-handed. Swaying the French will take a major American victory back in the colonies, where the British are getting ready to mount a new round of assaults. June 1777. Just south of Montreal, Canada, a new British general has arrived in America. General John Burgoyne surrounds himself with all the trappings that wealth and status afford. He has recently returned to the colonies, where he witnessed the British loss of Boston just 2 years earlier. Burgoyne's goal, to take revenge and end the war, whatever the cost. It is an endgame he has staked his career on. John Burgoyne has always led the good life. A gambler, a military man by career, a playwright by hobby, a social climber by marriage, Gentleman Johnny, as his soldiers call him, leans towards the dramatic. Before his return to America in June, the cocky Burgoyne wagers that he will have the war won by Christmas. Charles Fox, a member of Parliament who stood in opposition to the war, takes the bet with a warning.
Be not over-sanguine. I believe when you return to England, you will be a prisoner on parole. Charles Fox.
As commander of Britain's northern forces, Burgoyne aims to take the Hudson River, the vital waterway that separates the northern colonies from the southern colonies.
It's important to realize that in the 18th century, there are no bridges across this river. There are only a limited number of crossing points. If you control those points, you control key terrain, and you are able to sever the lines of communication that the colonists are able to use to coordinate their actions between Boston and Philadelphia, and certainly prohibit the transfer of troops from one side of the river to the other.
The British plan requires precise coordination across great distances. Burgoyne's force will move south down the Hudson to meet up with the man in charge for the British, General William Howe, whose forces will march north from New York City. Burgoyne's first target is a remote northern outpost, the mighty Fort Ticonderoga.
People referred to it as the Gibraltar of the North, or the Gibraltar of North America. It was, by all standards, the most spectacular fortress in North America. Angled bastions, very defensible, and it sits astride this very, very strategic water corridor.
July 2nd, 1777. General Burgoyne's force of 8,000 descends upon Fort Ticonderoga. The undermanned Americans are at a mighty disadvantage. Just 2,500 Continentals guard the fort. Skirmishes break out around the stronghold as British soldiers snipe at the Americans. But taking the fort will require a strategic advantage. Fort Ticonderoga sits on a peninsula surrounded by 3 mountains, but the lean American forces can only defend 2 of them. The steepest and most formidable, the aptly named Mount Defiance, is left unprotected. But from its ridge, artillery has an easy shot into the fort. It is the weak spot that Burgoyne will exploit. July 5th. Burgoyne dispatches a unit to the west side of Mount Defiance. Their mission? To drag their cannon to the top. It is a treacherous climb, but out of sight of the Americans. By noon, they crest the ridge and position themselves for a clear shot into the fort. With one move, Burgoyne puts the Americans in an indefensible position. And without firing their cannon once, leave the outmaneuvered Americans no choice but to retreat. It is an easy win for Burgoyne, and bolsters his belief that the campaign to take the Hudson River will be a simple one. News of the fall of Fort Ticonderoga reaches Paris, where Benjamin Franklin has been closely monitoring the war.
He's constantly waiting for his mail. I mean, none of our impatience for our mail could possibly equal what Franklin must have felt at that point. The ignorance is crippling.
But sometimes ignorance is bliss. That the undermanned American army has been forced to retreat in the face of an attack is the last thing Franklin wants to hear. On top of that, he has made little progress with King Louis XVI. Franklin is, after all, the representative of rebels. He is fraught with frustration.
There is nothing better to do here than drink. How can we fool ourselves that France might understand America better than Britain? How can we fool ourselves that a monarchy will help republicans revolt against their monarch? Benjamin Franklin.
The fall of Fort Ty hits General Washington's desk with a thud. His soldiers lost it without so much as a fight. And now the British Army is on the move. 7,000 soldiers are heading down the Hudson. The rest are stationed in New York City. Washington flounders and begins moving his troops up and down the river, hedging his bet against where the Redcoats might attack next. General Washington may be conflicted, but so too are the British. Their commander, William Howe, has gathered up his 13,000 troops and set sail from New York City. Destination, unknown. Howe is torn. He is expected to move up the Hudson to aid Burgoyne, but he can't escape his own designs, a fixation on conquering Philadelphia, the rebel capital. His decision, when it comes, will change the course of the war. The mighty Fort Ticonderoga, the gateway to the Hudson River Valley, has fallen to the British without so much as a shot fired. It is another defeat for the undermanned Continental Army and is an ominous start to the summer of 1777. Across the ocean in France, Benjamin Franklin's waiting game continues. Franklin is biding his time, looking for news from America, some victory that would open the gates to Versailles, would convince the French to join the war. But he keeps his intentions to himself. It is a secrecy that breeds intrigue.
For the first year that he's there, there's a real question. Is he here because he's running away from the American Revolution? Is he here to undermine it, or is he here to underwrite it?
Desperate to find out more, both France and England surround Franklin with spies.
It turns out, in retrospect, that his own secretary was a spy, and that anything that crossed Franklin's desk was sent back within the week via a little bottle sunk beneath a tree in the Tuileries to the British government. And those dispatches arrived regularly 72 hours later. Because of the espionage, Franklin realized the only way he could keep a secret was to keep it to himself. And he's very, very close-mouthed, plays his cards very close to the chest.
Franklin's silence is a calculated diplomatic strategy, akin to his favorite game, chess.
Life is a kind of chess in which we have points to gain and competitors to contend with. By playing at chess, we learn not to make our moves too hastily. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin follows his own advice too well for some. But he knows the time will come when he finally gets to play his next move. Back across the ocean in America, British General Howe remains adrift off the coast of New York City. 13,000 soldiers on 260 ships still don't know where they are headed. John Burgoyne's plan calls for General Howe to head up the Hudson, yet Howe is intent on Philadelphia. Revenge for his embarrassing losses at Trenton and Princeton.
Howe is obsessed with holding Philadelphia and sustaining Philadelphia, situated almost exactly in the center of the 13 colonies geographically, because it's the political capital. It's where the Continental Congress resides. It's an important strategic center too, both commercially as well as politically.
Howe makes his decision. He will abandon Burgoyne, his northern army, and the Hudson Campaign. He will invade Philadelphia. In one move, he changes the course of the war. August 22nd, 1777, Hartsville, Pennsylvania. American scouts bring word to Washington that Howe's fleet has entered the Chesapeake Bay. Their target is now clear. They are headed for the rebel capital. Washington immediately sets his army in motion, marching south through Philadelphia. 3 days later, the British land at Elk Point, Maryland, and begin their northward march. The two armies are now on a collision course. September 11th, 1777, Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. Washington positions his forces along the banks of a tributary called Brandywine Creek. It is here that he will make his stand against the advancing British. Brandywine Creek is the perfect place for a defense. There are only a few crossings along this stretch where troops can be transported from bank to bank, and Washington has them covered. By 7 a.m., the British reach the banks directly across the river from the main force of the Americans. Musket and artillery fire erupt between the two armies. 25,000 soldiers will clash on this day. The battle, intense and bloody. In the thick of the fighting, the Continental Army makes an alarming discovery. The weapons sent secretly by France months earlier have only now arrived, and many of them aren't working. Some of the muskets are fitted with the wrong cartridges. Others have shot of the wrong size. It renders them unusable. On the opposing side, the British are trying out a new and improved rifle. Captain Patrick Ferguson, a skilled marksman, is the inventor. The new weapon is lighter, has a longer range, and in Ferguson's expert hands is deadly accurate. During the fighting, the captain gets a high-ranking officer in his sights. But killing involves more than aim. On the 18th century field of battle, there is also the matter of honor.
The American Revolution occurs during what some historians term the Age of Limited Warfare. These professional military officers, who deemed themselves professionals, did not think that it was gentlemanly nor honorable to intentionally lay low an enemy officer.
It's an easy shot, but Ferguson passes it up. His decision possibly changes history. The man at the end of his barrel was, evidence suggests, George Washington himself. 4 o'clock strikes on the field at Brandywine. The Continental Army has successfully held off the British advances for 8 hours. But all of that is about to change. What Washington doesn't know is that his main force has only been engaging half of Howe's army. The other half has been sent on a day-long march to the west, around the American defenses, and is now headed for a surprise attack from behind. It is the same tactic the British used at the Battle of Long Island, and once again, Washington is surprised by the maneuver. Having outflanked the Americans, the battle quickly becomes a rout. "1,000 American soldiers are wounded or killed. Washington is forced to retreat north, giving up the fight and giving up Philadelphia. Six weeks later, the news reaches America's emissary to France, Benjamin Franklin. His hometown, the rebel capital, Philadelphia, has fallen to the British. In response, the sage statesman makes an unlikely quip. Instead of Howe taking Philadelphia, Philadelphia has taken Howe.
This is not only spin of the finest kind, from a man who, remember, made his name writing hoaxes and dispensing misinformation in his own papers. He knows his job, and his job is essentially to make it appear to the Europeans, and particularly to the French, that the American cause is a viable one, and moreover, that the Americans can win this contest. Those are all of them, at that point, fictions.
Franklin, as shrewd in his diplomacy as he is in his chess, will have to wait yet again. The unanswered question is whether the French will support America in its next move.
Monsieur Franklin, in France, we do not take kings so. Madame de Bourbon, French Duchess.
Ah, madame, we do in America.
Back in the colonies, America's Northern Army is getting ready for a battle that will turn the tide of the war. September 11th, 1777. Washington's army takes on the British at Brandywine Creek. 25,000 soldiers clash, but the Americans are outflanked by their enemy. It is another rout for the British, as the rebel capital Philadelphia falls into enemy hands. But British General Howe's decision to take Philadelphia has meant abandoning his northern army. With no knowledge of Howe's choice, General John Burgoyne, leader of Britain's northern army, continues his campaign to take the Hudson. And the gentleman general makes sure he travels in style. 30 carts of food, clothing and liquor take the edge off a campaign through the rugged terrain of upstate New York. Tonight, he is confident and in good cheer. Burgoyne has enlisted help in his campaign, a secret weapon that he believes will give him the upper hand. 500 Native Americans from the League of the Iroquois have joined Burgoyne's army. They will serve as guides to the British, helping them navigate the northern frontier.
The Indians were not really interested in theories of monarchy versus democracy. The Indians were playing it according to how is this going to play for us? Which side is going to be most likely to grant us our sovereignty? Who is our greatest friend, and conversely, who is our biggest threat?
Each Indian nation has to make a choice. Virtually none are able to remain neutral. Most, overwhelmingly, they side with the British.
For the Native Americans, it is a marriage of convenience. A British victory is their best hope for protecting their lands against the westward pushing American colonists. Burgoyne partakes in the ancient practice of sharing a peace pipe, but he wants the Indians to attack the Americans without mercy, and wastes no time broadcasting his objective, issuing a proclamation to the inhabitants of New England, a warning to all who stand in his way.
I have but give stretch to the Indian forces under my direction, and they amount to thousands to overtake the hardened enemies of Great Britain wherever they may lurk. The messengers of justice and of wrath await them. General John Burgoyne.
Burgoyne's proclamation is a fateful decision. July 27th, 1777, Western Vermont. Two braves capture a woman by the name of Jane McCrae. There is a struggle, a fight. A shot is fired. Jane McCrae dies, but it is unclear who killed her.
There are varying versions of this story, and some contend that in fact she was killed by militiamen firing on the Indians in an attempt to rescue her. However she actually met her fate, this is one of those sort of events that's prone to being manipulated for propaganda purposes.
The story spreads through the colonies with lightning speed and becomes fodder for brutal anti-Indian propaganda of the highest order. It is written that bloodthirsty Indians have killed a white woman, and Burgoyne is held accountable. Back in the British camp, the scalp of Jane McCrae is presented to Burgoyne, who receives it with disgust, even though he is the one who ordered the raids.
The savages, having scalped a young lady, their prisoner, fills me with horror. I would rather put my commission in the fire than serve a day if I could suppose government would blame me for such strong acts, such unheard barbarities.
But Burgoyne's reaction is too little, too late. The killing of McCrae becomes a call to arms. Militia grab their muskets and head to the Hudson Valley and begin to pour into Continental camps. For General Horatio Gates, who arrived on Washington's orders in August to take over as leader of America's Northern Army, it is the boost he has been waiting for. Gates is a proud, albeit disheveled man who comes from a clouded past. Born in Britain to a servant mother, he is rumored to be a bastard son. America has given him an escape from the rigid class structure of Europe. War, a chance to gain glory against his former home. But he harbors even greater ambitions.
Horatio Gates wanted to be commander-in-chief of the American Army. And it goes much beyond that. Whoever was the victorious leader of the revolutionaries would emerge as the leader of a new nation. There had to be a new ruler, some new kind of ruler. No one had decided what yet. I think he might have been that ambitious and that foolish.
Gates adds fuel to the furor over the killing of Jane McCrae, writing an open letter directly to his adversary.
That the famous Lieutenant General Burgoyne should hire the savages of America to scalp Europeans and the descendants of Europeans is more than will be believed in Europe.
They are harsh words to an old friend. Gates knows his rival John Burgoyne well. In the 7 Years' War, they were comrades in arms, registered one after the other in the British military ledger as gentleman to be lieutenant. Now Gates sees his chance for glory. In beating his old country and gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, he will prove himself to Congress, which, to him, still doesn't recognize his worth. Gates orders his army to a position where he knows the British will have to pass, just south of a region of New York called Saratoga. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne continues his southward march, but there is no sign of reinforcements. Burgoyne has made a fateful decision to press forward rather than wait for news from Howe. Clues as to what lies ahead are all around him. A royal patrol scouting close to Saratoga comes across a note pinned to a tree. Burgoyne had posted his proclamation. Now the rebels have issued one of their own. Thus far shalt thou go, and no further. September 19th, 1777. With numbers swelled by anti-Burgoyne sentiment, the rebel army is ready for a fight. Horatio Gates sees an opportunity to test the British just south of Saratoga on a piece of land called Freeman's Farm. Gates has a surprise for his enemy, an elite force sent by Washington himself, Daniel Morgan's riflemen. Morgan, a Virginia officer, fought in the 7 Years' War, witnessing firsthand the fighting style of the Native Americans. Inspired by what he saw, he has created guerrilla tactics that are new to the battlefields of the 18th century. Rather than attack in columns head-on, Morgan's men fire from cover. Noon. After a tough morning march through heavily thicketed woods, a forward picket of Burgoyne's army finally reaches a clearing. A moment to rest, they think. But Morgan's men are waiting. Fire rains down with deadly accuracy. All but one British officer is killed or wounded in the first assault. The ambush is followed by bloody skirmishes, the battle swinging back and forth through the afternoon. Until finally, at 4 o'clock, having inflicted their damage, the Americans fall back. The British suffer 600 casualties to the American marksmen and come to understand that these rebels may not give up so easily. In the American camp, militia keep pouring in. The army swells to more than 10,000. Victory against the 5,000 British soldiers now seems possible. Horatio Gates can feel it. So too can another general who wants to capture some glory for himself, Benedict Arnold. But before the two generals take on Burgoyne, they will find themselves in a battle against each other, each vying for credit in a campaign that will change the course of the war. The battle at Freeman's Farm, just outside of Saratoga, New York, has stopped British General John Burgoyne's southward march in its tracks and given confidence to Horatio Gates' troops, whose numbers continue to swell. That confidence is shared by another bold American general who sees his chance for glory, Benedict Arnold. Arnold comes from a prominent Connecticut family that fell on hard times. His alcoholic father squandered away the family's fortune. But Arnold would not yield to his lowly circumstances, achieving great wealth and success in business through sheer will. He has been in the war since the outset and has always made an impression.
He was spit and polish. When he sat on a fine horse, he was literally a commanding figure. Men looked up to him.
It was Arnold who helped snatch Fort Ticonderoga from the British 2 years earlier. But the credit for the victory went to the hard-drinking frontiersman, Ethan Allen. It is a slight that Arnold has not forgotten. But this campaign offers him a chance at redemption, to get the credit he feels he deserves. Meanwhile, around Saratoga, New York, the two armies wait, just miles away from each other. They wait, as soldiers do, for their next order. In the American camp, Gates and Arnold talk strategy over a meal of ox heart. Their army has swelled to twice the size of Burgoyne's. The question is, what to do next? And the two generals have two different ideas. Arnold, ever on the offensive, proposes an aggressive act, an attack on Burgoyne. Gates, however, is characteristically circumspect. Let Burgoyne come to them. The conversation turns heated. Tempers flare.
Horatio Gates couldn't stand Benedict Arnold, considered him an upstart, an arrogant upstart. And Benedict Arnold, like many of the revolutionary soldiers, called Gates Granny Gates, a fussy old woman.
But the headstrong Arnold takes his argument one step too far. Gates, in no uncertain terms, reminds Arnold that it is he who is the ranking officer.
And Gates banished his best general from the dinner table, insulted him, wouldn't let him come to meetings, told him to basically stay in your quarters, which were a little hut on the edge of the battlefield. And Benedict Arnold fumed as a result of that dinner and decided that he would have to defy the orders of his commanding officer because he believed the Americans were going to be beaten if it were up to Granny Gates.
In the British camp, General John Burgoyne is filled with frustration. News has finally arrived from Howe. There will be no reinforcements coming from the south. But Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne refuses to retreat.
Burgoyne is exceptionally ambitious. He is definitely a glory hunter. But his greatest failing was that, like many officers of his time, he placed a premium on individual martial glory. He wanted to gain fame for himself. Saratoga should have never happened. Johnny Burgoyne's pride, his hubris, is what precipitated the disaster at Saratoga.
With his supplies dwindling, Burgoyne decides to make one last push. An assault on the Americans just to the south of Saratoga on a rise of land called Bemis Heights. October 7, 1777. Burgoyne sends a reconnaissance force of 1,500 towards the American lines. Gates sets 2,400 of his men out to meet the British. It is the final engagement of the Battle of Saratoga. On the field, Benedict Arnold, in defiance of Gates' orders, leads the charge against the Royals.
Arnold employed snipers. He got riflemen, highly accurate, put them up in trees like snipers, not down in red uniforms with white stripes that you could sight. Arnold fought like an Indian, from cover with camouflage, surprise attacks. It was a new kind of warfare, and the British didn't adapt to it.
Through the smoke of battle, Arnold spots an opportunity he can't ignore. British General Simon Fraser seems to be single-handedly rallying the troops. Arnold makes a snap decision that changes the course of the fight. He orders his men to target the British officer. 1 month earlier, George Washington may have been spared assassination at the Battle of Brandywine. But at Saratoga, British officers are offered no such favor. It takes 3 shots. 3 shots that take down his adversary. With Fraser removed from the battle, the life seems to disappear from the British soldiers, who begin to retreat under the pressure of Arnold's advance. But not before taking a well-placed shot of their own. Benedict Arnold takes a bullet to the leg and barely survives being crushed by his horse.
When the battle was over, his second-in-command said, "Sir, where are you hit?" And Arnold said, "It's my leg. I wish it had been my heart." And I do too. I wish it had been his heart, because if he had died at that moment, he would have been the great hero of the Revolution.
With Arnold's leadership, the British attack is repelled and the campaign to take the Hudson comes to an end. Yet it is Horatio Gates who will take the credit for the victory.
Gates doesn't mention Arnold in his dispatches and garners all the glory for himself. The people and the press hail Gates as the new American hero. In fact, the hero of the battle was Benedict Arnold.
October 17th, 1777, noon. Two generals meet each other on a field of surrender. After a 7-month campaign down the Hudson, General John Burgoyne comes face to face with his old colleague, Continental General Horatio Gates. Burgoyne's ill-fated journey ends here, with the surrender of 6,000 of his soldiers, the largest capture of British forces in the entire war. Burgoyne will return home a prisoner of war, losing not only his year-old wager, but his military career. General William Howe, who delivered Philadelphia to the British with the best of intentions, has had enough. No one in Britain is celebrating the capture of Philadelphia. Instead, they blame Howe for not coming to Burgoyne's aid. Just 5 days after the surrender at Saratoga, Howe prepares his resignation to return home, leaving behind the rebels and the war that should have ended long ago. Across the Atlantic, America's envoy to France, Benjamin Franklin, receives the news. The victory at Saratoga has changed the war and changed the world.
I don't think anyone was as surprised by the news of Saratoga as Franklin. There had been nothing but bad news from the colonies. It's fair to say certainly that he is waiting for something like this. Saratoga is certainly the thing which finally puts him in a position to be able to sign the deal with the French.
Benjamin Franklin has played his game perfectly. Now, the next move is his. He dons his old blue velvet suit, the same one he wore 3 years ago on the fateful day the British ministry all but accused him of treason. He wears it again, at last, to Versailles and a meeting with the French leadership. The news of victory at Saratoga is exactly what France's King Louis XVI wants to hear. He pledges his army, and more importantly, his navy, to the American cause. It amounts to a declaration of war between France and England. The American Revolution, which started as a far-off colonial uprising, is now a world war. They might be celebrating in Paris, but as the winter of 1777 takes hold, General Washington has less to be joyous about. Horatio Gates's anointment as the hero of Saratoga again raises questions over who should be in charge of this army. Philadelphia, New York, and large parts of the colonies remain in British hands. Washington must turn his army and his leadership around, for the biggest battles still lie ahead. December 17th, 1777, White Marsh, Pennsylvania. A battered Continental Army, or what remains of it, marches north through the driving snow in search of winter quarters. The year's campaigns have taken a heavy toll on the soldiers. Their clothes are tattered, their spirits down. The Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, is feeling the strain as well. 3 months earlier, another American general, Horatio Gates, catapulted himself onto the national scene by defeating the British at Saratoga, New York. The victory has given America a new war hero, one with boundless ambition.
Horatio Gates wanted to be Commander-in-Chief of the American Army. And it goes much beyond that. Whoever was the victorious leader of the revolutionaries would emerge as the leader of a new nation.
At the same time that Horatio Gates's stock is on the rise, Washington's is in free fall. At Brandywine, Pennsylvania, the Americans fought the largest engagement of the war so far, and Washington suffered one of his worst losses. 1,000 American soldiers are wounded or killed, and Washington is forced to retreat north into New Jersey. The victory at Brandywine gives the British the prize they were after, the rebel capital, Philadelphia. Independence Hall, the seat of rebel power, now sits empty, a burning reminder of Washington's failures. America's rebel Congress is now a body in exile and have set up a new home 100 miles to the west of Philadelphia in York, Pennsylvania. In the chamber, there are murmurings that George Washington is weak-willed, that the general's poor judgment keeps the Americans from defeating the British.
The expectations that civilian leaders had, that Howe's army could be conquered just like that. There were doubters and carping and criticism and Monday morning quarterbacking against what he had done.
Revolutionaries like Samuel Adams are calling the abilities of their commander-in-chief into question.
Our troops are victorious in the north. The enemy troops are divided and scattered over a country several hundred miles. If we do not beat them this fall, will not the faithful historian record it as our own fault? Samuel Adams.
Congress takes action and names Horatio Gates to head the newly created Board of War, a position that gives him a say in American military strategy.
This is the low point of George Washington's professional life. Congress begins to lose confidence in him. Gates' followers are pumping up Gates, and the idea is then broached that Gates ought to be the commander-in-chief. But now, Washington, knowing that he's seen as weak, must win big soon to solidify that command.
But the Continental Army is in no shape for a fight. And in 18th century warfare, winter is the time to rest, to train, to resupply. For Washington, now is the time to rebuild his army and his reputation, and do it before the winter is over. It will be an uphill battle at the soon-to-be-storied Valley Forge. It is a strategic location, just 23 miles north of Philadelphia. Valley Forge is an ideal place from which to keep a close eye on the movements of the British Army and stop the enemy from pillaging the fertile countryside. Sitting on a plateau, the camp is easily defensible. Creeks and the Schuylkill River provide a natural fortification to the camp. But building and running a city a third the size of Philadelphia is a mammoth undertaking. Washington throws himself into the work. He designs the camp himself, down to the last detail. The layout of the barracks, the placement of roads, the location of its defenses. Washington enacts strict rules to fight typhus and dysentery. Soldiers who do not use proper privies face 5 lashes to be administered on the spot. Soldiers who contract venereal disease from prostitutes selling their services on the peripheries of the camp pay for their own treatment, $4 for the rank and file and $10 for the officers. These seemingly mundane tasks consume all of Washington's time.
We might accuse him of being a micromanager, but in fact this was a situation that needed micromanaging. He has to really pay attention to the minutiae because it's the minutiae that's going to kill off his army. dysentery and other camp diseases are going to create havoc in his camp unless matters of sanitation are attended to carefully. So he has to pay close attention to the details, and he does it really well.
Washington's hands-on approach wins the admiration of his soldiers. And he assures the men that he himself will share in every hardship and partake in every inconvenience. During the first month of construction at Valley Forge, Washington chooses to live in a tent at the edge of the camp, alongside his army. Life in Philadelphia, however, stands in stark contrast. For the British, the winter break from the war brings a return to the creature comforts that status affords.
The British Army is very warm and comfortable wherever they want to be, whether it's New York or Philadelphia. They have no problems. Their problem is deciding which tavern to drink at night.
The British may have lost at Saratoga, but they hold the rebel capital and are savoring it for all it is worth. Evenings are filled by social gatherings, and each Thursday there is a ball where Philadelphia's high society loyalists mingle with the British officer class. Back at Valley Forge, the temperature hovers around freezing, and many of the soldiers are forced to wrap their feet in rags for lack of shoes. But the men make do, fighting off the cold by playing cards, mending their clothes, and learning new drills. For soldiers like Joseph Hodgkins, a 34-year-old cobbler from Massachusetts, letters from home are a bittersweet reminder of what has been left behind.
My dear, I have looked for you till I know not how to look any longer. Monday afternoon I was very low in spirits, almost despair of your coming home. Brother Perkins and sister send their love to you. Your most affectionate companion till death, Sarah.
As the winter grinds on at Valley Forge, supply shortages become a problem. America has never had to feed and clothe an army. During the 7 Years' War, just a fraction of the soldiers' food came from the colonies. All the rest was shipped across the ocean from England. And since the outset of the war, the congressionally controlled provisioning offices have struggled mightily to supply the army.
Supplying the Continental Army was immensely complex. We call it the Continental Army, thinking of it as a national permanent army, a regular army, which it was. But in many ways, it's still organized and paid for locally. Each state was responsible for supplying its own troops, and this creates enormous confusion.
In February, the Army supply lines grind to a halt. The staple diet for the soldiers becomes fire cakes, a meager meal made of flour mixed with water into an unappetizing paste that is cooked over an open fire. It is a far cry from the promised daily ration of a pound of beef and a pound of bread. Washington is all too aware of the hardships faced by his soldiers. With his army facing starvation, he throws himself into a writing frenzy, petitioning the states for more food and clothing, pleading to Congress for more power to oversee the supply offices, and imploring local officials to send more aid. But for all his efforts, relief is slow in coming. Washington will need help to turn his army back into a fighting force. And it will come from a most unlikely source. A new arrival in camp, a Prussian, who goes by the name of Frederick William Augustus Heinrich Ferdinand, Baron von Steuben. February 1778. The winter at Valley Forge is taking a heavy toll on the Continental Army. 2,500 soldiers die from disease, more than have been killed in battle in the entire war. Thousands of others are incapacitated by sickness and hunger. Washington has done his best to hold his army together, but is still under pressure from Congress to mount a successful spring campaign and take back Philadelphia from the British. But to achieve that goal, he will have to enlist the help of others. On February 17th, a new recruit arrives in camp, sent by the American Congress to aid in the cause. He calls himself Frederick William Augustus Heinrich Ferdinand, Baron von Steuben, and wears the bejeweled cross of the Order of de la Fidélité, denoting an honorary knighthood from Prussia. Von Steuben carries letters of introduction, but no papers confirming his achievements, an omission that should be a clue, for the Baron is stretching his story, just as he's stretched his name. He has never risen higher than the rank of captain, and he has been turned down for service by the French, Spanish, and German armies. Amidst rumors, he has taken familiarities with young boys, which the law forbids and severely punishes. In short, von Steuben has come to the only army in the world that will have him, the Americans. The Baron's past may be shrouded in mystery, but Washington is desperate for leadership, for officers with European training. He puts von Steuben right to work. The task, to create a single method of training, a critical step towards a more professional army. And to do it before the winter is over. Von Steuben embraces the opportunity. The Baron starts small, spending hours each day working directly with a model unit that will be used to train the rest of the army.
Baron von Steuben is a remarkable figure. Von Steuben's genius was the ability to distill the complexity of state-of-the-art European drill tactics into a digestible form to this raw material that was the American soldier.
They are tactics that are new to Washington and his army, tactics learned during the Baron's service in the Prussian army. But he makes an important adjustment in the way he teaches them.
Von Steuben recognized that he was not dealing with Prussian conscripts. He recognized the individuality and the Republican notions of the population of troops that he dealt with, and he was able to take principles and tactics and give them to this force in such a manner that they were willing to receive it and that they were able to transform themselves from virtuous Republicans into soldiers in a professional army.
Under von Steuben's tutelage, the soldiers learn how to form solid, orderly columns, how to properly load and fire a weapon in formation, and the proper use of a bayonet.
The army that comes out of Valley Forge is in many ways much more sophisticated one than the one that goes in there. Von Steuben brings a new level of professionalism to the army, and that by itself creates its own sense of professionalism. It creates its own sense of belonging. They're belonging to something larger than themselves.
In a matter of weeks, the ragtag unit is marching in lockstep. Soon, every soldier is taught the von Steuben technique. It becomes the foundation for the Army's first training manual. Washington's army is slowly remade. It is nearly battle-ready. In March, spring finally comes to Valley Forge. The dark months of winter begin to fade away. Yet food shortages have been a recurring problem. For the young General Nathaniel Greene, watching his army go hungry is more than he can bear. At 35, the formidable Greene is a rising star in the army, even though he is an unlikely soldier. Born in Rhode Island, Greene is a successful merchant from a devout Quaker family that loathes war. But he is ambitious and fiercely loyal. When war breaks out, he throws himself behind the Patriot cause. Greene becomes the youngest brigadier general in the Continental Army at age 33. Now he has risen to the rank of Major General and is one of Washington's closest confidants, and one of the loudest critics of the Army's failed supply departments.
The Quartermaster General, Commissary General, and Clothier General departments are in such a wretched condition that unless there are some very good alterations in those departments, it will be impossible to prosecute another campaign. Our troops are naked, and the men getting sickly in their huts. Nathaniel Greene.
Greene's experience as a merchant leads him to take matters into his own hands. He leads foraging parties into the Pennsylvania countryside to round up food and supplies. But the citizens are often unwilling to give up their property, even to an army fighting for their independence. It creates a precarious situation.
Washington didn't want to alienate the local civilian population. He did what he could to supply the army, but he wants to protect that relationship with the local community.
But desperate times call for desperate measures. When persuasion fails, livestock and grain are occasionally taken at the end of a musket. Greene leaves the scared civilians with the only reimbursement his army is offering, the promise of future payment, an IOU. Greene's efforts impress Washington, who puts him in charge of acquiring supplies for the army. The duty-bound general accepts his assignment as quartermaster, but it is certainly not the commission that he had hoped for.
Nobody ever heard of a quartermaster in history. All of you will be immortalizing yourselves in the golden pages of history, while I am confined to a series of drudgeries to pave the way for it. Nathaniel Greene.
This is the classic case of a successful general being called back to the Pentagon to be a bureaucrat. And Greene doesn't want that. But on the other hand, it's a sense of Puritan guilt. It's a sense of sacrificing what's good for you, what's good for your country.
Greene dispatches foraging parties far and wide, south into Virginia, to the eastern shore of Maryland, and north into New Jersey, rebuilding the supply lines for the army. The efforts of Baron von Steuben and Greene over the winter at Valley Forge have given Washington confidence that he has an army that is now ready to take the fight to the British. Meanwhile, an ocean away, a bold American is pushing the war to a new and unlikely front, the shores of England itself. April 1778. The long winter at Valley Forge has finally come to an end. The Continental Army continues to train in preparation for the summer campaign, one that Washington hopes will bring a much-needed military victory and vindication for his previous losses. But the fighting season is still months away. For now, all the general can do is ready his troops. Unbeknownst to Washington, though, the war for independence is spreading to a new and unexpected front, across the ocean. On a chilly spring morning, a lone American ship, the Ranger, cuts through the water off the coast of England. Their target, the port towns along the western coast of Britain. It has been 700 years since anyone has raided these shores. 700 years since a foreigner has rained terror on the inhabitants of the British mainland. The architect of this bold plan? John Paul Jones. At first sight, the 31-year-old Jones is an unlikely captain. He is short in stature and soft in his speech. But the Scottish-born Jones is already a veteran sailor.
Jones is a proud man. He's a very handsome man, almost beautiful to look at. He's wearing a British naval uniform. Now you may wonder, why would an American naval officer wear a British Navy uniform? Because he thought it was better looking.
Jones is the son of a gardener who set out for the open sea at the age of 13 to make a name for himself working on merchant and slave ships.
Jones casts himself in his own play. And it's a play of upward mobility. This is a notion that's very 20th century, but in the 18th century, It was unusual. In the 18th century, your place in society is defined. That's not the way John Paul Jones wants to see the world. He wants to be a rising figure. He wants to overcome his modest origins and become a gentleman.
It takes him just 8 years to reach the rank of captain. But shipboard life is a dangerous business, and at 28 he is forced to flee to Virginia to escape charges of murdering a mutinous crew member. He starts life anew in America, adding the last name Jones to avoid being found, and joins the fledgling Continental Navy in 1775. But what America calls a navy is little more than an awkward flotilla of mismatched merchant ships, clumsily converted for battle. A fighting force that could never stand up to the superior power of the British Navy. So the ambitious Jones sets out on his own course.
Jones is a military genius, and he has a fundamental insight, which is that we're never going to beat the British by playing some defensive game. The British Navy at this time has more than 100 men of war. The American Navy has none. So they're not going to win some massed naval battle. They have to go guerrilla.
John Paul Jones returns to the waters of his youth and in surprise attacks shocks the enemy. Raiding British merchant ships along the Irish coast, burning supply ships along the west coast of Britain, and leading an attack on the port of Whitehaven, the very town Jones set sail from as a young boy.
The idea is to terrorize the British people, to show them that the cost of suppressing the American Revolution is going to be high, to take the fight home to the Brits.
It is a strategy that has an immediate effect. News of the raids hits London like a thunderclap.
This morning, an express arrived with alarming intelligence that an American privateer had appeared off the coast and proceeded to Selkirk House, which they pillaged.
Along the northwest coast of England, a general intimidation discovers itself on every appearance of a sail.
But for his tactics, raiding towns and taking merchant ships, Jones becomes known as the Pirate Jones. It is a label that plagues him.
John Paul Jones wants to be seen as an officer and a gentleman, not as a pirate, and it hurts him.
In an attempt to prove that he is more than just a pirate, Jones sets his eye on one last goal: taking a British warship. He finds the perfect target anchored off the Irish coast, the Drake. With 20 guns, all 4-pounders, she is a relatively even match to Jones's Ranger. As is his custom, Jones flies the British naval ensign, which allows him to slide close to the enemy ship. And at the last minute, Jones gives the order to fire. The battle is on. The two ships exchange broadsides at close range.
18th century warfare was supposed to be gentlemanly, at least for the gentlemen who fought it. It was almost like a formal dance. At sea, ships, like a minuet and a ball. Jones didn't believe in all that. Jones believed in what today we would call total war. He would put men up in the tops, as they were called, and up the mast on these platforms to blaze away with muskets, with guns.
These new tactics give Jones the upper hand. His crew rakes the deck of the Drake with hot grape shot that tears through sails and limbs. And after just 1 hour, the British lower their flag in defeat.
Its significance is that no American ship has taken a British ship in a clean, fair fight. And the British Navy considers itself to be so superior to any other navy. So for an American ship to defeat a British ship was a real blow to the Brits, and it told them, what are we getting into here?
The Ranger makes a hasty retreat, heading to France, the British Navy in desperate pursuit. For Jones, the mission is a success.
What was done is sufficient to show that not all their boasted navy can protect their own coasts, and that the scenes of distress, which they have occasioned in America, may soon be brought home to their own doors. John Paul Jones.
Jones has brought the revolution right to the doorstep of the British. Arriving in France, he becomes the toast of Paris, the ideal of American heroism. Jones's war will continue. The following year, he will lead a modest fleet aboard his new ship, the Bonhomme Richard, winning the greatest American naval battle of the time against the British warship, the Serapis. And years later, for his daring missions, John Paul Jones will become known as the father of the American Navy. Back in America, George Washington prepares to take the fight to the British Army, looking for the battle that will restore his reputation once and for all. May 5th, 1778, Valley Forge. 3 months of drilling have given Washington a new confidence in his army. The efforts of Washington, Nathanael Greene, and Baron von Steuben, whose service has now earned him the position of Inspector General of the Army, have emboldened a force that is now 13,000 strong. Washington's perseverance through the hardship of the winter has held his army together. He is now eager to test the mettle of his soldiers, and the British are about to provide the perfect opportunity. British headquarters, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A new commander-in-chief is taking over the British Army, Sir Henry Clinton. His predecessor, William Howe, recalled after the British loss at Saratoga. Clinton arrived in America in 1775 with Howe and General John Burgoyne. Both generals left America in defeat. Now, he is the last one standing.
At the time of the American Revolution, positions of command devolved to the next man in the line according to seniority. Promotion was subject, with very few exceptions, to the rigid law of seniority. And in this case, Henry Clinton was the only choice because he was the next most senior officer following the recall of Howe.
Clinton is as concerned with how his actions will be interpreted, how he will be judged. That awareness of, if I don't handle this right, what's this going to mean for my reputation back at home?
Clinton has good reason to worry about his reputation. The war for independence has changed dramatically. It is no longer a battle between two adversaries. Now there are three. For the past year, the Americans have been courting France, the world's other superpower. Leading the effort is the rebel emissary, Benjamin Franklin. At 72 years old, Franklin is an internationally renowned scientist and writer who has entered a new phase in his career, that of diplomat. America's victory at Saratoga has shown the French that the colonies can hold their own against the British and has persuaded them to join the fight against their ancient enemy. Now the elder statesman is working out the final details in the newly signed Treaty of Friendship. France gives money and supplies, but more importantly, offers their navy to the American cause.
French naval support is absolutely crucial for American resistance. The British, they have to now take the naval dimensions of this war into account. They can no longer say we can take naval supremacy for granted and concentrate on winning the war on land.
Back in Philadelphia, British General Clinton opens his first orders, which have just arrived from England. The British ministry has been forced to make a dramatic choice. In May 1778, the British hold Philadelphia, New York City, and Newport, Rhode Island. Now there is a very real danger of a blockade by the French fleet at any of these ports. So Clinton is ordered to give up the rebel capital of Philadelphia and consolidate his forces in New York City. It is a forced retreat. Not how Clinton had expected his leadership to begin. American spies in Philadelphia rushed dispatches to Valley Forge with word of the British action. The news finds Washington and his generals discussing battle plans for the upcoming summer. Now the question on the table is whether to move on the British when they begin their retreat to New York. Washington is still stinging from last year's losses at Brandywine and Germantown and is eager for a fight. But before he can take on the enemy, Washington has to take on one of his most talented generals and one of the most outspoken challengers to his authority, General Charles Lee. The British-born Lee is an eccentric but capable officer and a brilliant military tactician. But in December of 1776, as he was supposed to be on his way to aid Washington as the Americans fled New York, Lee was instead captured by the British while he lounged in his nightclothes at a tavern. Despite the blunder, Washington worked hard to get the experienced Lee back from the British in a prisoner exchange.
Lee is arguably the most qualified general officer in the American Army in a strictly military sense. He fought in the French and Indian War, he fought in continental Europe during the 7 Years' War, he fought from Russia to Poland. He's exceptionally experienced, but this experience breeds some hubris. He thinks that he knows better.
Lee seemed to have an agenda throughout the war of really carving out an independent command for himself, and one could speculate that he probably would have liked to supplant Washington as the commander-in-chief.
Lee's arrogance has always been an issue, and he questions Washington's plans at every turn. But today he takes his argument one step further, suggesting that the American force would never stand a chance fighting the Royals head-on. Coming from someone who spent more than a year in British captivity, Lee's stance raises questions about his loyalty.
There was always an aura of suspicion around him, in Washington's mind at least. Part of the reason I'm very suspicious of Lee is he wasn't treated as a prisoner. He had dinner with the other officers. He had a convivial life with them. It was not the kind of treatment that was given to other revolutionaries when they were captured.
What none of the Americans knew at the time is that while in captivity, Lee had offered advice to the British as to how to beat the Americans and bring the conflict to an end. An act of treason that would color Lee's actions for the rest of the war. June 20th, 1778, Mount Holly, New Jersey. The main force of the British Army, 11,000 soldiers, have begun their withdrawal from Philadelphia to New York with a supply train that stretches more than 12 miles. Washington sees the British as vulnerable and wants to bring on a fight against the advice of his generals, including Saratoga's victor, Horatio Gates. But Gates, now stationed in Albany, New York, has become obsessed with a major campaign into Canada, an offensive that Washington calls the child of folly. Even supporters in Congress view the idea as impractical because it would split the American army in two. Gates's plan is rejected, and the American army, 13,000 strong, breaks camp at Valley Forge and sets off after the British. For more than a week, the two armies march across New Jersey, covering 90 miles in a searing June heat. American detachments ahead of the British fell trees, destroy bridges, and engage in skirmishes, slowing the British Army's progress. Until finally, Washington sees his opportunity for a full engagement. On the night of June 24th, Washington lays out his battle plan. At the crossroads of Monmouth Courthouse, an advance corps of 5,000 soldiers will move forward and engage the rear of the British Army as they prepare to get underway. Washington, with 7,000 soldiers, will hang behind the advance force. If the British retreat, the Americans will let them go. But if they engage, Washington will move forward and join the fight. In accordance with military etiquette, Washington's senior officer, General Charles Lee, is offered command of the advance force.
Lee claims the right to lead the attack because he's inexperienced second in command.
Lee didn't turn it down. He took it, which was unfortunate, because Washington had to let him go ahead of the rest of his army.
On June 27th, Washington issues the order. Lee will attack the next morning. The British Army has been retreating across New Jersey for more than a week. And against the wishes of his generals, George Washington has set his army out in pursuit, seeking an opportunity to bring on a full engagement. Finally, at a crossroads called Monmouth Courthouse, the Continental Army catches up with the British. June 28, 1778. A devastating heat has engulfed the parched fields of eastern New Jersey. In the morning, General Charles Lee's men set off towards the British rear guard at Monmouth. Washington and 7,000 soldiers wait 7 miles behind Lee's troops. The general waits anxiously for word of the offensive, but so far, there has been none.
His army has been trained and turned into a new and hard-fighting army, and that army and its commander are now convinced that they can beat any army on the face of the earth, and they are eager for the fight. And that fight comes on one of the hottest days of the war. Different records show that the heat was somewhere between 100 and 104 degrees on the morning of the battle.
At noon, the first progress reports come in from Continental soldiers that appear to be in retreat. The news is unbelievable.
Lee was not attacking. What was going on here? He had the strength, he had the trained men who knew how to maneuver now. Then all of a sudden he began to retreat when he should have attacked.
In fact, Lee had no battle plan. Nothing. He was hopeful of victory somehow. It's obvious to all the men at Monmouth that there is no plan. The men retreat.
Furious, Washington rides ahead and encounters General Lee himself.
Washington personally rode up and took over and relieved Lee of his command. Nobody accurately knows what Washington said because it was almost sacrilegious to write down when George Washington swore. And whatever he called Lee, it was enough for Lee to get the idea and to get out of there.
With Lee reprimanded, Washington turns his attention to a more urgent matter: the British Army, which is fast approaching. But for the British soldiers, marching in 100-degree heat in their full wool uniforms, it is an exhausting advance.
We proceeded 5 miles in a road composed of nothing but sand, which scorched through our shoes with intolerable heat. The sun beating on our head with a force scarcely to be conceived in Europe, and not a drop of water to assuage our parching thirst. A number of soldiers were unable to support the fatigue and died on the spot. Lieutenant William Hale.
At 1 o'clock, less than half a mile separates the British Army from the Americans. Washington must act fast, rallying the troops on the high ground of the field. Within an hour, the American soldiers have formed their ranks. The British arrive, hot and exhausted from their march, only to face a Continental Army in a strong defensive position. The winter's training at Valley Forge is paying off, and Washington knows it.
He then does something astounding. He rides back and forth in front of his lines to rally the troops, putting himself in the line of fire, risking his life as he asked his own men to risk their lives. People who know Washington in the war think that he has a feeling of invincibility because he puts himself in the line of fire so often. He's almost convinced that he can't be killed. The British open up on him and miraculously miss him.
The Battle of Monmouth erupts. More than 20,000 soldiers clash in the brutal heat. The fighting rages for hours, long into the summer afternoon. For the men on the field that day, it is some of the most intense combat they have ever seen.
The briskest cannonade commenced on both sides that I ever heard. If anything can be called musical when there is so much danger, I think it was the finest music I ever heard. Henry Dearborn.
The English commander to the right hollered, "Come on, my brave boys, for the honor of Great Britain," and killed many with their bayonets. British Lieutenant Alexander Dow.
The shattered remains of our battalion suffered from thirst and heat, of which several died. Some preferred the shade of the trees in the direct range of shot to the more horrid tortures of thirst. One of these had his arm shattered to pieces. Lieutenant Hale.
The British advance repeatedly, but Washington's men repel each of the assaults. In the thick of the fighting, a young woman named Mary Hayes Macaulay risks her life caring for the wounded and bringing water to the parched American troops. She is just one of the scores of women who take to the battlefields of the Revolution and become known to the soldiers as Molly Pitcher. The Battle of Monmouth is the longest of the Revolutionary War, lasting continuously more than 5 hours. Sunstroke, not musket balls, is the biggest killer on this day. Scores of soldiers on both sides die from the heat.
When the smoke had cleared at Monmouth, it was a draw. Washington knew, and the country knew, that this new army that had come out of Valley Forge was a good one. They had held their own against the British. This renews the public's spirit for the war and forever solidifies Washington's position as the unquestioned commander-in-chief.
The Continental Army has proven itself a capable fighting force. Washington has proven his leadership as their general. For his retreat in the face of the enemy, Charles Lee will face court-martial. He will be wounded in one duel and challenged to 7 others for suggesting that the Americans could not stand up to the British. Disgraced, he will retire to his Virginia home and die there with his beloved dogs in 1782. The rebel capital, Philadelphia, is now back in American hands, and Washington turns control of the city over to one of his most trusted generals, Benedict Arnold. The bold general is now a military governor. He will make choices here that will forever change his past, his present, and his future. On the field that evening at Monmouth Courthouse, the entire army lay together in exhaustion, and Washington sleeps here on the battlefield with his men. The French Navy is now under sail. Destination, America. Just maybe, the war can be won before the year is out.